And this is how it works. Someone will go to a focus group and they will sit down and say, well, if you want to talk to black people, here's how you do it. Use these words. You want to talk to women? Go use these words. You want to talk to Latinos? Use these words. And what ends up coming is you're like a robot trying to go down the list and please every single member of the coalition.
I've heard similar, ideas coming from like Anna Kasparian too, talking about how at the end of the day, it's just so difficult. I don't know how to navigate sometimes having conversations. Like sometimes I'm just scared to talk to black people, and I'm in my head every time I hear that. Why? Are you worried you're going to say something racist? Are you thinking something racist right now? And also, shout out to Dead Domain. They are the creator of what a lot of people on the internet are saying is a scathing takedown of Brianna Wu.
Obviously, to tell her Venus, you take too many chances, you're too wild with people in the street.
This is one of the final scenes of Jenny Livingston's classic 1990 documentary, Paris is Burning, which explored the underground culture of New York drag scenes and the people in it. The woman here is Venus Extravaganza, a trans woman and performer and aspiring model who had also taken to sex work in the hopes of paying for gender reassignment surgery. In the film, she recounts narrowly escaping a violent encounter with a man who discovered she was trans on a date. During the filming of Paris is Burning, Venus was found murdered. Her body was found on Christmas Day, and she had been strangled just a few days earlier in the Duchess Hotel. To this day, her killer has never been found. I bring this up because Venus's story, despite taking place 3 decades ago, is eerily prescient. Anybody in the trans and wider LGBTQ community likely knows someone who has been sexually assaulted, physically assaulted for their identity, or even just who had to turn to sex work to make money, a precarious pursuit that endangers many trans people today. Now, what does this have to do with Brianna Wu? On January 3rd, 2025, Brianna Wu tweeted a response to someone calling out a post where she decried progressivism as the reason for trans people's current political woes. Her response was, many trans women go into sex work because we have autogynephilia, and being objectified is erotic for us. And the first thing I thought of when I saw this post was Venus. I thought about all of my friends who had been turned away from jobs because they were trans, who had been forced into sex work by circumstance or other people who had survived only on it and who had been stripped of their dignity because sacrificing that dignity was the only way they could sometimes eat the 1 or 2 meals they got a week. And I bring up this decades-old documentary not just because it's personally resonant, but because it shows how long this kind of thing has been an accepted part of queer and trans life. Exploitation isn't new for people who know and maintain community with other trans people. This reply, like most things Brianna says about trans people with such authority, is not based in fact or even really in her personal experiences. Unless you want to say she finds the idea of being objectified personally titillating, which is certainly a valid reading of what she says here. For the record, I don't think that's what she's getting at, but it would tie into a very common theme in Brianna's work, which is a consistent fetishization and reduction of what it means to be a woman, something we will examine later. Brianna likes to play at being an authoritative voice for the trans movement. In the last few years especially, she has turned away from progressivism and has attempted to engage right-wing and even far-right voices, courting TERFs, all in the name of being a reasonable...
I'm seeing a lot more people than should be retweeting Richard Hanania. I guess in some cases, I will extend the grace of maybe you didn't know who Richard Hanania is, but the dude's a Nazi. Like straight up race IQ science kind of shit Nazi, the other races have inferior intelligence kind of person. And he's just like, I guess he's been rebranding himself as some kind of like center right lib or maybe center kind of style lib and being critical of the Trump administration. And that's enough for some people to retweet him. But every time you do, you're retweeting a Nazi or you're interacting with a Nazi.
Voice for the trans community, something nobody asked her to do, but she's still taking it upon herself. Now, I want to be open and say that because I had so many questions from my time looking into Brianna's history, I did attempt to reach out to Brianna multiple times through multiple avenues to sit down and have an interview. She had blocked me on multiple websites, and I'll be honest, that is completely fair considering some of the not very nice things I've said about her. Mostly at the time, those were reactions to what I saw as her abdicating the responsibility to help other trans people instead of her throwing other identities like non-binary people, like myself, under the bus. So I can't blame her for not being open to discussion. I maintain that I earnestly did want to hear her take on most of the things I discuss in this video, and if she watches it and wants to sit down and have a convo and set the record straight, my DMs are open to you, Brianna. That being said, she did respond to some other folks who asked for an interview in my stead by labeling me a weirdo degenerate. Again, no hard feelings, Brianna. I don't like you either, and I don't want to be your friend. But I also at least try to be a little fair in my assessment of people, and just because I don't like somebody doesn't mean I don't want to depict them honestly, which is why I found it somewhat annoying that she would say this within a few hours of platforming just dickheads like Lior Sapir or Richard Hanania. See, she placates these figures by essentially saying they're right that some trans people are evil and are grooming kids, but not all trans people, not the transes like Brianna. And as I'll show, this is just the latest in a long line of what sure look like shifting grifts for Brianna Wu. During her time in the spotlight, she has had many titles, from congressional candidate to game developer to artist, question mark citation needed, and at every step of her journey, she has managed to claw her way to slightly more relevancy, leaving a long list of enemies in her wake. I'm not going to sugarcoat my words. I want to be as clear as possible why I took on this project. If there's a thesis to this video, it's this. From everything I've found, from all the information available to me, and that I've heard from firsthand sources, Brianna Wu is a volatile liar and a fraud, and should have no future in any kind of political analysis or creative endeavor, let alone
hey, Dark Native. Everyone check out Dark Native's channel. What are your thoughts on Hanania saying he doesn't believe Nazi stuff anymore? I would say that if you were at one point in your life a full-blown neo-Nazi, then you should be spending your time probably just trying to unpack the fucking Nazism. Like, you were not just a neo-Nazi, you were an active person using your platform to spread Nazism. You should be doing that instead of, like, I want to be a public figure now. I'm a liberal. Yeah, and now everyone should be, like, you know, paying attention to me and supporting my social media. Like, I've seen, there's so many people who have just done the, like, I was in the alt-right pipeline to, so that's why I'm now the leader of the vanguard as a leftist YouTuber stuff. And it's like, why not spend time actually trying to unpack what led you to becoming that, right? Like, because a lot of the time it doesn't seem like you've actually dropped all the Nazi bit. You've kind of just tried to find a new lane where you can try to, you know, push a certain regime that you want to see enacted just from a different angle.
Presenting any group of people. Because there are so many concurrent themes running in her story, this video will kind of be all over the place by necessity. There's no way to talk about the totality of Brianna's various controversies without jumping between them to show the decades-long patterns of her behavior, but I promise, it's all leading to the overall point: Brianna Wu should never be taken seriously by anyone. I haven't just trawled through old forums and found some dirt. I've spoken with several anonymous sources that knew her, interacted with her directly, and even worked with or under her. None of them had very nice things to say, by the way. In fact, most people I've talked to who worked with Brianna don't seem to. Brianna Wu is not a genuine person. I know this because I've seen how she acts in private, where she often plays the role of a mean girl, talking shit about others, often over their appearances or their optics rather than any kind of principled stances. Even the people she would publicly claim to ally herself with, like Destiny, aren't safe from her insulting them when she thinks nobody else is watching. Another example is the time she speculated about Shoeonhead being the victim of assault. Or, as I'll show later, how she has often attempted to hire people to create dossiers on who she deems her political enemies. But this is going to be a
5 to 20K is how much campaigns charge for a book, which is basically a dossier. I'm not expecting full-time work like that. Okay, sounds good. Let me flip that upside down. What would you feel is reasonable for you to deliver for 3K a month? I think like one good deeply resourced story would be fair. I'm not going to be banging on your door, just good faith efforts. I really hope none of the money from Rebellion Pack was going to this, to the $1,000 dossier, enemy dossiers. What the fuck? Like, I just want to let you know, regular people also get worried sometimes when there's a large community, you know, being led by content creator going after them. But then I guess you just got to do it like the rest of us common folk do, which is try to find the dirt yourself. I go, reddit.com. Let's see what they've said about me. Ah, yes. All right. I'm building my dossier. Not quite the same thing as paying someone like, well, I just, so you know, the average cost of a dossier, it's about 5 to 20,000. But hey, what about 3,000? Do you think you could do the work that a serious, legitimate political team could do in the research for that much money? That's wild.
Long video, so stash that one away for later. And I have evidence for everything I'm saying, by the way. She seems to only care about optics, not right or wrong, which is probably why her opinions have shifted over time as she makes her broad pivot to being a dollar store Blair White. Additionally, I've had several people share their DMs with me from Brianna and stories of how she has attempted to bully them and force them into stepping into line, particularly in recent years as she's taken it upon herself to represent that reasonable trans population. Some of these I will also share later in the video. These are just some of Brianna's.
The chat. Thank you for the Buddy 28. Hello, Raiders. Welcome in. Can all of you go to twitch.tv/thechap, give the chap a follow back. If you're wondering, some people are asking who's Brianna Wu. So Brianna Wu, up until recently, was, I think, the head of Rebellion Pack, which is the one that Jank and TYT are doing fundraising for, essentially to try and promote political candidates that lean more progressive, or at least deemed to be more progressive leaning as per the criteria set forth by, again, Cenk and TYT. And I would say post-October 7th has probably been one of the most vocal supporters of Israel, and also one of the most aggressively racist people towards Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, and anyone who she thinks is remotely, in support of Palestinian liberation is Hamas, is a terrorist or a terrorist supporter, is anti-Semitic, it just goes on and on. But basically, yeah, very mean person online.
More duplicitous facets that will pop up throughout what can loosely be called a career. Like I said, it's going to be all over the place, and as a result, this video will be filled with more callbacks than a Marvel Phase 5 writer's room. She is incredibly thin-skinned, talks authoritatively about things she has very little or no knowledge of, blatantly lies about her experience and credentials, and lashes out at anyone who might challenge her. People have spent the last 3 years or so asking why she so suddenly pivoted to the right. But the reality is, this is who Brianna has always been. While my other deep dive investigative pieces have spent ample time disproving the conspiracies and lies spread by people like Matt Walsh or Synthetic Man, I have far less of that to do here. That's not to say Brianna isn't a liar. She is, and I'll be debunking some of her talking points accordingly. But the real evidence of who Brianna isn't in her worldview. In fact, I'd say it's the opposite. Brianna Wu constantly shows just who she is by her lack of any ideology aside from being a desperate, attention-seeking grifter. The first thing to know about Brianna Wu is that she never had much to worry about in life. When she was 19, she went to Millsaps College, only to drop out to found an animation company that, like her college endeavors, was funded by her parents to, as Wu would attest later, the tune of over $200,000. The animation studio was known as Socially Unconscious Productions, and we will talk about it more in a little bit when we discuss Brianna's art and how she's lied about that over time. These aren't just random assertions, by the way. Much of this Wu has talked about in her various interviews with the media, from an interview piece on Inc.com in 2015. Quote, "At Ole Miss, Wu studied journalism and wrote for the Daily Mississippian, but she never graduated. She left school the first time to start her own video animation company, came back, and dropped out for good in 2001 after getting swept up in the excitement surrounding George W. Bush's election as president. Her parents were big donors, and they got her a ticket to an inauguration ball. That led to a stint working in Washington, long enough to become disillusioned with Republican politics, as well as dangerously dependent on Ambien, a sleep aid. Her parents, in the final act of support, brought her home to Hattiesburg and paid for a bed at Pine Grove, where Tiger Woods would later be treated for sex addiction." End quote. She's also publicly posted pre-transition pictures that confirm her identity as the person we're about to hear stories on. Now, I don't really care if someone ambles through college to find their direction in life. I did it, plenty of people do, regardless of economic bracket.
Only the most max left
I'm
hanging
also
out there.
not interested
True.
in talking about Wu's time in rehab. The reason I included the full paragraph was to talk about her lifelong links to Republican electoral politics, because that is going to come up later. The real problem is that despite not graduating, many interviews in the future would regard her as a graduate from Ole Miss, even her own website claiming she graduated from there. But there isn't really much of a record of her actually finishing that degree. And on her LinkedIn account, for example, it says she attended from 2003 to 2008 and majored in journalism and political science. Her LinkedIn bio currently reads, quote, "Brianna Wu is a software engineer, entrepreneur, and outspoken advocate for women's rights. One of the most prominent women in technology, Brianna founded her first $250,000 startup at 19. In running for US Congress, Brianna is working to bring a new generation of voices and values to Washington." And already you can see some of the aspects of Brianna that will become recurring themes in her story.
Is she still with TYT? She's stepping down from Rebellion Pack. I don't know if she's still going to be working with TYT, though. Neither Cenk or Brianna have confirmed if they're just completely separating business-wise.
Namely, depicting herself as far more qualified than she actually is, saying she's a startup founder at 19 without mentioning that said startup was shuttered and had nothing to show for the effort. Also pursuing journalism and political science, something to note moving forward, as she shows a shocking amount of acumen for either of them. Brianna likes to talk about her time in college as a reporter, and there are articles written under her name before she transitioned to verify this. She worked at the school newspaper covering school newspaper things, but according to later forum posts, she would depict this as being on a crime beat. Maybe she did cover crimes at some point. I wasn't able to find any articles to back that up.
Look, Mark, you know this. Like, you just showed that heartbreaking TikTok at the video at the beginning of this. That 3-year-old girl on the ground. That breaks my heart. I got my start in journalism, like covering police successes in Mississippi, which is very racialized.
Brianna had always been interested in being an artist and tried to get a comic she was writing into the local paper. And according to some forum gossip, when she was denied, she blew up at the teacher and person who ran the newspaper, calling them both slurs. Namely, calling the teacher a sand N-word. Now, I want to tread very carefully here because there's very little to go on for verifying this incident, but I do think this kind of meltdown, taking offense over her artistic ability, and the fact that she did work for the newspaper are all entirely compatible with Brianna's trends of behavior sense and line up with the timeline of her career. particularly the anti-Arab slur. While she might not be slinging such harsh language anymore, she's still blatantly racist towards Palestinian people. The first time I met her, I was the opinion editor at the Daily Mississippian, and I turned to see this creepy fuck standing behind me. I shook her hand, and she pulled away, saying, "Ow." She then explained she'd broken her wrist in a bicycle accident that had almost killed her and given her amnesia. She explained that she wanted to be a columnist, and she had previously worked for George W. Bush in the White House, but she had since realized how R-slur and evil all conservatives were. About this time, my phone started ringing, and I politely ignored it while I talked to this girl. Then it rang again and again until I answered. It was the managing editor who had ducked behind the front desk.
Why is it someone always fails at something media related? Oh, and then becomes in the fast pipeline. Also, I mean, if you want to work in media, I'll have anyone know, especially people who are starting out, you will fail a lot. I hope one failure doesn't turn you into like, well, I wonder what's going on the fascist side of the internet now. Because yeah, if you want to get into writing, especially in any form of media, like you are going to fail hundreds and hundreds of times. Be prepared for that. Get ready. If a single failure or rejection makes you upset and makes you suddenly be like, I wonder if right-wingers would be more appreciative of my particular brand of edgy humor, then you may have just wanted to make that kind of content in the first place. Just gonna say that.
And was whispering, "Stay calm and don't react to this, but this girl isn't supposed to be here. She has a restraining order. Get rid of her." By this point, I was concerned that this girl might knife me at any moment, so I told her to write 3 columns and that I'd evaluate them and get back to her on whether she could write for me. Parenthetical, I'm still proud of my ability to remain poised and convincingly pretend that the Daily Mississippian had any fucking standards. Turns out, a year prior, she'd come in wanting the Daily Mississippian to run a comic strip she had been doing. When she was told they weren't interested, she flipped out. She called one of the workers a fat dyke, and when Dr. Husni came to her defense, she called him a raghead and sand N-word. They got a restraining order to keep her away from Farley, but when they moved to Bishop, it no longer applied, and she was actually able to weasel back into working for the SMC. Here, we see several pieces of corroborating evidence with Brianna's own stories later. Things that are incredibly specific, like working with the Republican Party, which, again, Brianna would admit to in later interviews. So with these pieces of the puzzle, I feel pretty comfortable saying this did happen, and before transition, Brianna did go on a homophobic and racist rant. And right now you might say, well, that's not a lot of evidence. And you're right, I'm taking a little bit of this on faith, but having spent as much time as I have now studying Brianna, I can say this absolutely falls within the realm of her regular behavior and how she continues to act even today. So by the end of this video, I think you'll probably agree with me on this one. And plus, you'll be shocked to learn this kind of outburst and homophobia would come back later in her life. Additionally, there are pieces of art from her time in college when she was crafting this comic strip called Election Eve that, while made under her dead name, the same name cited in the forum gossip, is in the same style and even shares similar designs with Revolution 60, Brianna's eventual sole video game creative credit, particularly the characters Holiday and Minuet, who are recurring through much of Brianna's creative work. These comics and the artistic similarities further cement Brianna as the same person mentioned in the forum posts. Mind you, these posts were idle gossip years before Brianna became any kind of notable political or game industry figure. Socially Unconscious and Election Eve aren't really notable except for how poorly they were received, with the flat jokes often depicting offensive stereotypes and not making much sense, at least according to the mail-in section of the college newspaper. Thanks to Andrea James at Transgender Map for help with these sources, by the way. And speaking of her brief comic strip writer stint, I can't really talk about this era of Brianna without acknowledging her probably made-up girlfriend, Lauren Malovey, in 2001. During her time with Socially Unconscious, Brianna, then pre-transition, was writing her comic Election Eve, with Malovey apparently the primary artist. Now, the art style is already pretty distinctive and similar to Brianna's own, so keep that in mind. Malovey never posted a picture of herself, but blog posts exist on the Socially Unconscious website claiming she and Brianna were partners and in love. Curiously, there are posts under Malovey's name, like product reviews circa 2004. The way it's written is notably similar to Brianna's own assertive and casually abrasive style, and internet sleuths would later discover the only address from anyone named Lauren Malovey matched the same house as a pre-transition Brianna. Malovey is, as it turns out, also a Bond girl's last name, Cara Malovey from the 1987 film The Living Daylights. You'll notice that Brianna is a big fan of spy fiction, and you can see it in her art of women with all the updos and the go-go boots and bright, garish, skin-tight suits. It's like Austin Powers' Silent Hill. Then there's the evidence via Socially Unconscious's own website that Brianna publicly advertised looking for female models, citing Lauren being camera shy. Perhaps most damning is that after Socially Conscious Productions was shut down, Lauren Malovey seems to have almost entirely disappeared, which, as we would soon see, coincided with Brianna's transition. Now, I don't like speculating at what I can't prove, but as a trans person, I think this feels familiar to how a lot of people might try exploring their own gender behind the anonymity of the internet. I honestly don't care if Brianna made up an entire internet girlfriend to explore ideas around femininity and gender expression, which is kind of what it looks like happened here. Everyone's done internet cringe when they were younger, nobody was exploited and nobody was hurt by this, so I don't really care. And you might ask yourself, then why bring this up, especially when there's only anecdotal evidence to go on? Isn't it possible this Lauren Mallovy just so happened to live at the same place, write similarly, draw similarly, and act similarly to Brianna and then disappeared before Brianna transitioned? Come on. Come on. It is technically possible that there is someone named Lauren Mallovy out there, but what makes Lauren notable, however, is how it's not the only time there would be compelling evidence that Brianna Wu would craft an identity or person on the internet to support her. So like most things in Brianna's story, we're going to come back to this later. Going back to the animation studio startup, Wu was given money from her parents to start. You may have noticed I mentioned she went to Millsaps and then referred to her going to Ole Miss. That's not an accident because she was at Millsaps before Ole Miss, and it's here she would put out her first comics. A lot of stories from Brianna's time in college are hard to verify, not just because she hadn't transitioned yet, but because she constantly either lies or omits details about this time in her life publicly, despite some details leaking through in various interviews. And after internet weirdos on Kiwi Farms and 4chan began targeting her during Gamergate, she's gone to extensive lengths to try and bury certain aspects of her past, such as the aforementioned racist outburst. But one thing is for certain, she came from a rich-ass conservative family who helped her through every difficulty in her early life, from rehab to funding her own startup when she was 19 years old. From a story titled, quote, "Don't Mess with Brianna Wu," posted to Fiction Mania in 2006, she also mentions being able to have finished laser hair removal just 6 months into her transition, something that is prohibitively expensive for many trans women even today. I don't need to even speculate that growing up rich affected Brianna because she's been open about it, saying in 2014 that her millionaire parents affected her upbringing and outlook on the world. She was given $200,000 to start an animation studio that eventually dissolved before producing any kind of product. If the
Okay. That's one hell of a get. I don't know if you can really pull the whole, like, you know, I did it on my own. I did a startup. I was, you know, the founder of a remarkable animation startup by 19. Yeah, but I mean, like, you got $200,000 for your parents?
mentioned ad for a model to pose as Lauren Mallovy is any indication, the studio's ambitions were to turn Election Eve into a movie, and were apparently working on a sequel novel before there was anything even released aside from the comic strip itself. The level of exuberant, blind, naive ambition would become another commonality in Brianna's saga. But that doesn't mean that Brianna didn't have something to show for her time in art animation in college. She has a long history of art with a, let's say, distinctive style. Now, I don't want to specifically make fun of anybody's art here. Art isn't easy, but I do find several things about Brianna's art interesting, particularly how she draws and very explicitly fetishizes women's bodies. And by interesting, I mean, it's like I can tell a lot about a person and how she sees the world from it. Like that Jake Gyllenhaal character in the one movie he did with Wolverine. You know the one. Much of her art depicts busty, rail-thin, leggy women, often in skin-tight or very little to no clothing. This is another trend in her work over the last 20 years. There's very little variation in the body types of women, or for that matter, the style in which they are written. Almost all of her characters are generically headstrong women, independent badasses who feel rooted in an outdated brand of Obama-era girl boss feminism. Again, aesthetically, there are a lot of overlaps we can see with Brianna's inspirations, like pulpy spy fiction, specific anime and manga, Final Fantasy, and more. And yes, of course, we have to talk about the MLK Terminator with the KKK Ninja Girls. There's just no other way to describe it.
What?
This piece was apparently the cover for Crossed Genres and was accompanied by this blurb from her husband Frank Wu in 2009. Quote, Brianna went to University of Mississippi, where a famous race riot took place. Thus, the building is the Lyceum, where you can still see the bullet holes in the columns. As one of the lone liberals on campus, Bri wanted to do her own commentary on it. So, we see Martin Luther King with a rocket, but it's okay because he's a Terminator. And we also see KKK members, but they're all sexy ninja girls in skimpy white outfits. And now that MLK is free at last.
I'm sorry. This is too much internet too fast, all right? You gotta... At first, I was just like, well, yeah. I mean, a lot of this is probably what you'd come to expect. Rich upbringing, conservative parents, you know, volunteering for Republican. But this, what? It's Martin Luther King, Terminator, fighting and blowing up KKK members who happen to be skimpy women. All right. Okay. Go on, please.
From his fleshy shell, he's going to kick their butts. 60s girls in go-go boots and jetpacks fight alongside. Remember when I said she lacked political instincts, despite apparently studying political science? I'd like to present to the court Exhibit A. If I thought Brianna had any real understanding of political struggle, let alone MLK and his ideas around reactionary politics, intersectional movements, or really anything about civil rights...
No, I feel like that weird little drawing we just saw, that's like That's the final boss of I'm not racist because I'd vote for Obama a third time if I could. That's pretty much where, like, faux progressive white liberal feminism goes. That you'll end up there and be like, wait, this is deeply offensive. Why would you make this? Why would you think of this kind of a nightmare scenario, let alone feel the necessity to show the world, your vision? And then it's like, oh, I thought I was fighting racism. I see.
I'd say it would be disrespectful to slather the imagery of the civil rights movement in her knockoff manga pinup fetish art style. But I don't want to give her that credit for understanding those things to begin with. As seen in even more recent tweets, her understanding of racism, let alone civil rights struggles, are constantly shown to be...
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to see a lot of them over the course of this, but Free Palestine openly calling for violence and terrorism. The KKK regularly came to my college, Old Miss, to protest, and we let them. It's a free speech issue, but they never openly called for violence like Free Palestine.
Thin at best, and virtually non-existent at worst. Now, we will talk more about Brianna's artistic output when we get to Revolution 60 and her stab at game development, but having touched on her various artistic exploits, I feel a need to examine Brianna's constant character self-inserts. These depictions of women aren't just something that she fetishizes, but it's also how she, I believe, to at least some extent, sees herself. Normally, I think calling things self-inserts is hack-level internet criticism. When it's leveled at game developers, it's almost always not true. For example, incidental passing similarities are bound to happen in art as an extension of the creator's inspirations and personality. But in Brianna's case, there's a lot of evidence that the characters she makes aren't just representations of her interests, but how she sees herself going through the world. Remember when I talked at the beginning about how Brianna says trans women enjoy being objectified? When I first heard that, it immediately felt out of touch with the reality of survival sex work, but the more I've learned about Brianna, the more it makes sense. She doesn't consider the perspective of others, but she does fetishize femininity herself. And it's not just femininity, but a specific brand of headstrong anime protagonist coolness. I have no other way to describe it, honestly. As an example, here's an article she would write during Gamergate. Just listen to how she describes herself and pay attention to the fixation she has on sports motorcycles, a recurring motif for many of the scantily clad women in her art. This section is a little long, but bear with me because this bit, written by Brianna herself, is such a valuable insight with how she sees herself and goes through the world, and more importantly, how that just changes depending on her whims. Quote, "I'm late for a programming meeting with Maria. I don't have time to be stuck in Boston traffic. So instead of grabbing my car keys, I don black, skin-tight leather armor and leap onto my motorcycle. It's a 2009 Honda in racing red, something straight out of Akira. I've leaned into highway turns at 80 miles an hour, feeling nothing but speed, the air whipping all around me, and my thighs gripping a 212-degree engine for dear life. My emotional connection to this 410 pounds of fuel and metal is intense. Idling at a red light, I see a woman waiting to cross. She has my figure and looks to be my age. The frazzled look of motherhood is about her, disheveled hair and perpetual distraction. She's hunched over to hold the hands of two kids so beautiful that my heart gives an involuntary lurch, an instinct hardwired into my brain in ways I don't understand. It hits me hard as if this is an alternate reality version of myself crossing the street, a Brianna that had made drastically different choices. The woman notices me. Look at the girl on the motorcycle, she says to her children. Our eyes meet. I recognize my gray-blue shade in her eyes. I was adopted and had planned to do the same, but recently I've changed my mind. I wonder for the billionth time if the right decision is to concentrate on my job. I'm certain that if I had children, I would be failing at my job. I've hit my 30s, a period when it seems all of my friends suddenly have kids. That's a priority shift completely incompatible with goals. Startups require you to give it all or go home, routinely requiring long nights, longer weekends, and blood and toil. If you aren't willing to put in the hours, eager replacements are standing behind you. If I fail, the women I work with will all be out of their jobs. The light turns red. I release the clutch and twist the throttle, and my doppelganger and her children disappear in my wake. End quote. So we can pretty clearly see that anime influences seeping into Brianna's perception of herself and the real world around her. Her long-running fixation with sport motorcycles apparently tying into it, but don't miss out the vaguely fetishized description of her in skin-tight leather wrapping her thighs around an engine with an intense connection to the fuel and metal. This isn't written tongue-in-cheek, by the way. This is meant to be a somber reflection of a place and time in her life as a woman. I don't think this ever happened, by the way. I think it's another example of Brianna sensationalizing her life, something we are going to see much more of. She likes to craft this kind of elaborate narrative about something passively happening to her that also just coincidentally works to sum up whatever grand argument she's trying to make in whatever piece she's writing. And yet it's so ephemeral that there's no way to verify it actually happened. She'd just be saying shit sometimes. If you're familiar with Brianna's modern positions on being trans and trans rights, this also might seem at odds with what she says here. Nowadays, Brianna will go out of her way to say some dumb shit like, trans women are just boys that need hormones or we will break. And these arguments of hers are an effort to court favor with TERFs and broadly anti-trans or gender-critical commentators, mostly conservative. She now argues against trans people, quote, invading women's spaces, and argues in favor of essentially seeing trans women as fetishistic men, promoting no shortage of ideas that provably put queer people and trans people in danger. And she does all of this unironically, despite the fact that, as you can see here, she spent several years, over a decade in fact, depicting herself as a biological woman and using that pretense to position herself as a voice on women's issues.
I think I pass reasonably well, but when I go to the gym, I shower at home just because if someone can tell I'm trans, I don't want to upset them. I think women deserve the right to say, no, we don't feel comfortable with you in our space. So I would say to my sisters out there, I understand that it can be dehumanizing the way that we're treated sometimes. The way that TERFs talk to us is it's brutal. It is cruel. It is so mean, but we will get so much further with getting goodwill from the public, with humility and grace and trying to get people to buy in and for them to see our humanity than we will by forcing them.
In pieces like this and myriad Gamergate interviews and articles she would write, she never discussed her status as a trans woman, only depicting herself as someone who's always been a biological woman. Could this be because at each point in time, depicting herself a certain way was, at least in her mind, guaranteed to get her maybe a little bit more attention? For example, depicting herself as a cis woman during the perils of Gamergate, and now coming forward as a trans woman to lend credibility to her political arguments against other trans people. I'll let you decide as we dig more into Brianna, and specifically her long history of opportunism. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We have a lot more to talk about before we get to Brianna's time in Gamergate, and the events that would give her the bigger spotlight she has always been chasing. Also notable for Brianna pre-Gamergate was her time spent on Susan's Place, where she was a moderator. I had no idea what this place even was before sifting through Brianna's past, but apparently it was a notorious forum that caters primarily to an incredibly outdated view of trans people, in particular medicalizing transness and trans identities as a disorder.
I've seen this, yeah. We haven't seen this one. I think this was from yesterday, or 2 days ago. Just saw some Palestinian children try to stone a dog to death. Yeah, quite a thing to say about a group of people who have been dehumanized to the point of genocide, putting that kind of propaganda out there.
Based on this archived post, Brianna was apparently banned.
Which also, like, one of the reasons posts like that pissed me off beyond just the horrifying racism on display of trying to, again, make a group of children just appear as just, like, brutal savages deserving of a genocide kind of shit. You know, like, again, that was 2 days ago. Is that, like, I see actual children with their limbs blown off every fucking day when I open my phone. It's just like, that's just the reality. It's like, yes, another 20 kids have been burnt alive, or they've become amputees, or another hospital or an orphanage has been crushed, or another fucking, and you're just like, oh, Jesus Christ, this horror will never end. And that's real life, you know? That's what's actually taking place.
Forum in 2007, after some kind of incident that was deemed unbecoming a moderator, and it appears the forum manager even said, quote, I had hoped to allow her to leave with whatever dignity she could, but apparently that isn't going to be allowed to happen. Though I couldn't tell what incident had occurred here. So, much like stories of her in college, we can see Brianna has a history of being abrasive and confrontational to anyone who even peacefully speaks out against her. It's actually kind of funny, half of Brianna's past wouldn't be identifiable as being her if it wasn't for the way she very specifically reacts to other people and criticism. We will see much more of this abrasive, commanding tone in the future, so by the end of this video, you'll definitely recognize her distinctive style of online interaction, which is to basically act like an authority figure on any given subject and belittle anyone who might challenge her, regardless of her actually being qualified in what she's saying, because most of the time she's not. Also, during her time on Susan's Place, she spoke often about how Christians were evil and oppressive, an understandable opinion because
Oh God, hey Thought Slime, Mildred, it's been so long. Israeli children would have humanely rained white phosphorus on the dog. right, you know, at the end of the day, like, just we need to recontextualize all this. We need to really understand that there's a moral army and an immoral army, and in this case, yes, you may see some people who are currently undergoing a genocide, forced starvation, the ethnic cleansing, complete destruction of everything around them, the amount of fucking trauma all of that would bring to you, but I imagine, you know, that it's still something we need to spend time condemning. Have you condemned the children that Brianna Wu saw apparently attacking a dog today? Have you condemned those children? I don't know if you can have an opinion on this topic unless you specifically condemned the children that Brianna Wu saw attacking a dog.
at the time she had likely been cut off from her family and was by this point, I think, living with her husband, Frank Wu. It's also worth bringing up the time she talked about having no sympathy for any detrans people. There are several other commonalities between Brianna in 2007 and her attitudes now. For example, her insistence on using the word transsexual other than transgender, which might just be a time she was in type of thing. I also want to take a little detour to go talk about her live journal entries from around these times, which also detail her, I'm going to say, frankly, fucking unhinged ideas on politics. Just listen to this shit. Quote, let me preface this blog by saying that I think gay rights are the preeminent moral issue of our time, the modern equivalent of slavery. It's one of the top 3 issues I vote on, and I fully intend to go demonstrate in Denver's Gay Pride Parade in 2 weeks. It bothers me deeply that 1/10 of America's population are treated like second-class citizens. That said, I think it's an error to see women's issues and gay issues as synonymous. I don't especially feel that gays are allies when it comes to women. I think we usually get along well, but I've occasionally felt that gays see us primarily as competition for the penis. Okay, no, serious. Okay. When I watch drag queens, I can't help but feel insulted, as if that offensive cartoon is what they think feminine truth is. There are so many issues women have that gay men never have to think about. Our increased healthcare costs, equal pay issues, access to reproductive healthcare, and the threat of rape and violence. Concordantly, there are many gay issues that don't affect me. I've never had to worry that society didn't approve of my sexuality or marriage rights. Lots to unpack here. As I mentioned, we see her already depicting herself as a cis woman, not a trans woman. She's concocted this bizarre framework where gay men resent women as competition for penis, and then proceeds to say drag is a offensive cartoon that gay men think feminine truth is. That despite her actually making literal cartoon representations of how she saw femininity. Even in the previously mentioned 2006 Fiction Mania post where she recounts her first 6 months of transition, she essentializes femininity to what she saw as feminine traits she had pre-transition, like making food for an ungrateful partner, or defining profanity in speech as a masculine trait. Quote, generally speaking, girls are nicer and much more cooperative. I find myself obsessed with the importance of always being nice to people, even people I disrespect. Part of female communication is coming to consensus rather than being dominant. This comes second nature with estrogen. Also, estrogen makes you live in your own world. I sometimes find myself oblivious to my immediate surroundings, concentrating on something as insignificant as a hair on my desk. Estrogen also makes me more reticent to say what I'm thinking because I understand more deeply how important it is to get along. And later in that same Fiction Mania post, quote, and although I might dismiss it, being a girl is a lot of fun. Makeup, nails, fashion, and exercise were all things I took to easily. It's fun to wear skirts and to have long hair, but it's also important to remember that's not what being a woman is about. It's also about the standards you hold yourself to. It's about your capacity to be weak when it would be easier to be strong. What the fuck are you talking about? What the fuck, Brianna? Remember the MLK art and what I said, how she doesn't understand intersectionality and political organizations and movements? This is a lot like that in a lot of ways. Throughout her life, Brianna has seemed terminally unable to consider the struggles of others if they happen to coincide with her own. Instead of understanding political movements and structures as overlapping Venn diagrams of who is affected by what in different ways, she just seemingly wants her own little well-defined circle to claim as her own, regardless of if it pushes anybody else out. This is something she currently loves to do with non-binary folks and basically anyone she doesn't see as really trans. Again, this is a lot. We got a long ways to go. So it's safe to say, as far back as even the mid-aughts, Brianna was regarded as odd, abrasive, and even weird to and about other trans and queer people. Now, I don't want to say Brianna still thinks this reductively about gender because, in fairness, that was 20 years ago, but I bring it up because I think it colors in some of the shade she approaches gender and identity in for later. On Susan's Place, we can, for example, go back and see her being real shitty about other trans people, essentially saying she doesn't want to hang out with other trans people because why would you hang out with trans women if you see yourself as a woman? Which is amazingly stupid logic, because if you see yourself as a trans woman, you shouldn't have a problem hanging out with any kind of women, you fucking dork. Even in places where she should be seeking community and understanding, like with other trans or gay people, she seems to have no interest in anything but setting herself apart. I wonder if that'll come back. It will. It will. But what I find most interesting here is how similar some of these ideas are to Brianna's current turf-friendly turn. It's no surprise, right, that she would still be an abrasive, selfish person who doesn't consider the lives and existences of others, but that's not the part I find interesting. What I find interesting is how she would change her opinions in the coming years, being broadly supportive of a wider queer community. Like this Reddit post where she still claims to support non-binary people and calls them transgender. So either she changed her opinions between her early transition and then changed them back again, or she was simply aligning herself with what was then broadly progressive positions at the time, that time being when she was in the spotlight for Gamergate and then her political aspirations right after that. I mean, what are the odds she would change her opinions and or how she depicts herself multiple times in ways that would very specifically give her more support? But this was in 2015, slightly after Gamergate, so I won't get too far ahead of myself. Let's jump right into Brianna and Gamergate.
Now we're into the part of the internet that I know things about.
Oh, hey there, Kickstarters. I'm four-time Hugo Award winner, Frank Wu. For the last 3 years, we've been working on the video game Revolution 60, and here to tell you more is anime legend Amanda Wynn Lee.
What's the exfiltration plan?
Whoa.
Quiet. I think we can sneak past them. With Revolution 60, the story is yours to tell.
In 2007, Brianna...
This looks just like a reboot, but with Brianna Wu characters.
met Frank Wu, who would marry her. In 2009, she'd claimed she had a grad degree she didn't have. In 2010, her fairly wealthy husband would then fund Brianna's endeavor in gaming, releasing a game in 2014 called Revolution 60. So, let's talk about Revolution 60. Brianna's sole gaming credit might feel familiar if you remember the art I showed off earlier in the video, and that's because several of the characters are straight up recycled from Election Eve and her other art, Holiday and Minuet being chief among them. Now, apparently, if you can believe such a thing, Brianna wasn't very fun to work with, as noted by this former employee of Brianna's studio, Giant Space Cat, ending the thread with the observation that Frank was the only one seen at the game's convention booth because Brianna was too busy with interviews. She's also been called out on social media before by other workers, and when I reached out to former development teammates to see if they had anything to say, no one responded except for one who simply said, "I don't talk about Brianna anymore, good luck." Now, Revolution 60 was a iOS release in 2014 with a Steam release slated that was delayed by 2 years to September 2016. These delays would result in some Kickstarter and Patreon backers being unsatisfied when the game did release and was still basically the same. And not very good, at least judging by the user scores on Steam. It's harder to go by the game's few professional reviews because there's evidence that either Brianna or her husband Frank Wu had close personal relationships and friendships with several journalists who reviewed the game. Now, regardless of any possible positive reviews, the game's overall reception would be middling at best, and most of the user reviews skewed negative on both iOS and the Steam release. Because Brianna was a target of Gamergate, it's hard to say how much of the game's criticism is legitimate, or just angry trolling, but by and large, it seems like the early reviews of the game on iOS praise the game's ambition, but overall range from middling to negative, a sentiment shared by Steam reviews citing game-breaking bugs and technical issues. If there's one thing this game is remembered for, it's probably the art style, which is a 3D adaptation of Wu's comics years earlier in that it is almost entirely a cast of spindly doll-like women. Notably, several character designs, like the one featured in this poster, would be eventually changed, and in interviews Brianna would cite feedback from other women specifically for shifting her character design ethos, which may explain the changes. Again, it sure seems like Brianna's definition of strong femininity is like fetish gear.
These are... So on the left is a character from Soul Calibur 5, and on the right is your character from Revolution 60.
Absolutely.
And you know,
So,
to the superficial observer, these might look the same.
They might. I think it's all about intent. You know, I created these character models myself, and well, at least I did the design. But you know, so the difference is like Vanessa and Holiday both have very skin-tight outfits. Yep. But the difference to me is when I played Piano 3, I saw someone I could imagine myself as.
Yeah.
She's cool. She's badass. She's prolific.
Yeah.
She's awesome. Yeah. And the difference is all about empowerment and intent.
Within a few weeks of release, Revolution 60 didn't reach further than the top 1,000 downloads for iPhone, despite being a free download that included the demo and a purchase that unlocked the rest of the full game. Now again, this video isn't about examining Brianna's creative work and tearing it apart. Aside from examining commonalities between this and her early work that support conclusions like the fabrication of Lauren Malovey, I don't really care to examine much in Revolution 60. It seems like a garish, uncoordinated genre blend that lines up with all of Brianna's previous work, blending her distinct influences in a way that never feels original or unique. But I do think it is telling that despite spending more than 4 years developing the game and several hundred thousands of estimated dollars, primarily funded by her husband Frank Wu, Revolution 60 was the end result. While Giant Space Cat as a studio did ship a product, the sheer amount of time and money expended echoed Brianna's first startup at 19 that wasted similarly exorbitant funds on her creative endeavors. Add to this little things in the game's design that just make me scratch my head, like all the female characters using the same character model, like all the characters apparently having 10,000 polys, which would be hysterically unoptimized for iOS at the time, and probably contributed to the numerous technical issues. Much of the soundtrack are royalty-free songs, tons of the assets are apparently just from Unreal Asset Packs, and more. Again, most of this was found years ago by internet sleuths, so thank them for their work so I don't have to play this thing. Okay, but so what? She put out a middling game, maybe she wasn't a very good boss, and pissed off Kickstarter backers. Well, it's because like everything else Brianna does, no matter how unsuccessful, her time as a game developer didn't dissuade her from seeking a spotlight, using what she would sell as her expertise in the industry to spark conversations about being a woman in said industry. Which was the real start of Brianna Wu's story. For most people in the media sphere, the first time they heard about Wu was during Gamergate, and bear with me because there was so much random internet drama I've had to sort through with various factions, backstabs, inconsistencies, and perspectives. I've done my best to source and cite everything I say, like I always do. And having said that, I think it's safe to say Brianna Wu was the biggest opportunist on any side of Gamergate. Now, I don't have time to regurgitate the full timeline of everything and everyone associated, but for those who don't remember, Gamergate was a hate campaign leveled at Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian specifically. These two, and several others throughout the gaming industry, were targeted for various reasons, ranging from being vocal proponents of basic feminist theory about female game characters being too sexualized in the male gaze from Anita, to Zoe's controversy around a review for their game that kicked off the whole thing. If you want a truly in-depth and incisive look at the controversy, I highly recommend my friend Savvy Writes Books video on the subject, as she goes incredibly deep through the controversy step by step in a way I just don't have time to do here. The broad strokes are, while some people tried to focus the movement on a nebulous idea of ethics and accountability in game journalism, for many people Gamergate consisted of several harassment campaigns that made some women in the industry feel incredibly unsafe. And that was before Brianna Wu came into the picture. This article from The Guardian lays out some key points in the Gamergate timeline, such as bomb threats in March 2014 after an appearance by Anita Sarkeesian as announced, and the August 16th, 2014 blog post that alleges Zoe Quinn slept with someone at Kotaku for a positive review. And then just seemingly out of nowhere, after months of harassment concentrated on these two women, Brianna is mentioned on October 9th. You see, it's hard to talk about how Brianna fits into the picture between Anita and Zoe because she kind of doesn't. When Zoe and Anita were getting death threats and harassment, Brianna wasn't a well-known industry personality by any stretch. Despite what she'd say later about being one of the foremost women in tech, nobody really knew who she was. She was working on an indie phone game with very few eyes on it that didn't look very good, sporting Brianna's trademark lack of style and failing to generate any wider interest upon release. Yet, as a woman in the game industry, she took it upon herself to taunt and mock the Gamergate dorks she saw as basement-dwelling losers. In fact, she spent a lot of time and effort trying to goad people into engaging with her online. I don't want to make it sound like she didn't get any harassment, by the way, but there is overwhelming evidence that Brianna continually went out of her way to poke and prod the Gamergate forums, which you can see in these tweets from October 10th, 2014. You can see from these tweets she starts the mocking around 10:30 a.m., and by 4:30 p.m., she announces the same day that 8chan has doxed her, and proceeds to talk about fleeing her home with her husband for fear of violence, particularly pointing to threats not from 8chan, but from a Twitter account, Chatter Whiteman. 3 days later, Brianna had an interview.
Neutral Good Podcast. Yeah, I highly recommend if you want to learn about the history of Gamergate, but you don't have time to watch YouTube videos, check out Neutral Good Podcast.
On the front page of Cosmopolitan. Soon enough, the list of her interviews would encompass the Boston Globe, Verge, Polygon, Huffington Post, VentureBeat, Daily Mail, BuzzFeed, Six Axis, and like a dozen others, all focused on the narrative that this Gamergate harassment campaign had driven a game developer from her home. Now, this is anecdotal, but I spent hours Googling, gathering, and searching for interviews done by Anita, Brianna, and Zoe during this time. When it was active in 2014 and the year or so following, with rare exceptions like an appearance on a talk show from Anita, almost all of Quinn and Sarkeesian's interviews came years after the harassment campaigns that were threatening them and their families' lives. Brianna wasn't like that. For as much hate as they received and were targeted for, they very obviously wanted to try and continue living their lives, and were hesitant to be cast as some kind of ideological leaders on the front lines of Gamergate, despite not being given much of a choice. Compare, for example, Anita being quoted as saying it's frustrating to be known as a survivor of Gamergate, and then Brianna continuing to wear it as a badge of honor, to this day proudly touting her facing down the internet hordes as an achievement.
I'm a former game developer, and I think most people know me from Gamergate. You know, I remember during Gamergate, you know, there was this expansionist thing that it wasn't enough to talk about the number of women we were hiring in the game industry. You know, now we had to obliterate whiteness.
This is really fascinating because I didn't understand completely, even when researching Gamergate the first time when I was making a documentary on it, how exactly Brianna Wu, like how so much of the focus started moving from Anita Sarkeesian, for example, or Zoe Quinn onto her, specifically her and her, you know, history in game development and stuff like that. And it is true that it's like her history in the industry up until that point was basically making that one game that I myself have not even played
as something that we were featuring in games. And I'm like, it's a little bit extreme, but we'll go along with it. So it was just one more step after another.
I'm not saying Brianna was never harassed or sent death threats, but the speed with which she not only entered the conversation, but went from nobody knowing her name to apparently needing to flee her house for fear of her life, all the while she continued speaking up, is so wildly at odds with what you see from Zoe and Anita. That's just a fact. You can take it however you want. Oh, and let's not forget the fact that she talks shit about them later in some DMs. We'll talk about that more when we get to the long list of enemies she's made. This is, however, not at all at odds with Brianna's long-observed history of needing attention and shifting her aims and approaches to get that spotlight. This is another fact. Anita and Zoe, for whatever you might think about them, had their entire lives derailed by Gamergate. Brianna, however, suddenly got a platform, and I don't think it's a coincidence that this happened to be around the time she was still trying to get her eyes on her personal game project that floundered upon its initial iOS release. She seems to have used the opportunities afforded by the copious media appearances to not only drive home the idea that she was personally being persecuted and suffering from this movement, but also that independent and female game developers needed support, like she needed, for example, for the game that she was developing at the time, the game that nobody really cared about before she fled from her home, and the same game that would get reviews and press coverage from the same outlets that allowed Brianna to basically uncritically write whatever she wanted about Gamergate. The thing about Gamergate is, at the time, it neatly divided the industry into for or against. If you were perceived to have spoken out against harassment, you would be labeled an SJW cuck, and if you expressed any kind of apprehension about the overly flat criticism of people like Anita Sarkeesian, you would be easily lumped in with a bigoted hate mob doxing and attempting to ruin people's lives. When tensions run high, there's not a lot of room for nuance in these screaming matches between sides, despite the best efforts of plenty of people, and a number of commentators and internet historians have tried to approach the subject with that nuanced sense. It was the perfect environment for someone like Brianna to thrive in, where she could make whatever accusations she wanted, and when asked for proof, would simply accuse someone of being a Gamergator, like she did with notable not Gamergator David Pakman during a kind of now infamous interview.
The reason I chose to show what was going on with me was because the industry had chosen to stay silent. It was literally a choice for me to make my life, put it in danger, and to talk about this openly in the hope that would force the industry to finally look in the mirror and address some of these things.
Well, let's unpack that, because that's interesting to me. When you talk about the industry has remained silent, can you be a little more specific in the sense that in spending quite a bit of time researching and preparing for this interview, it seemed without question that some of the threats you received through Twitter and publicized were reported ostensibly by those also claiming membership or allegiance to Gamergate. So are we really talking about the movement as the problem, or are we talking about a faction of those identifying with it as the problem? So the question about just this account, BROLOLZ, that's you, right? Is that a sock puppet account? Did you try to hide the fact that that was you? What's the story with that?
No, oh my God, this is the most ridiculous thing on the entire planet. I'm very happy to address this. So a tactic that Gamergate has done quite a bit with Not Your Shield is they've created fake accounts from, like, say, a black feminist woman, and they put it out there, and they try to portray themselves this way. I created an account that's similar to, there have been other parody accounts, and the idea was this was a frat bro that was very for feminism. And it is just a silly joke. In fact, to make it very clear that it wasn't a sock puppet, because I was worried about people thinking I was doing that, I announced it on my Twitter. I just completely set it on the account. It is nothing more than a joke. And
so it's a satirical account. You never meant it.
It's a satirical account. If you don't understand it's a joke, it's because Gamergate doesn't understand the examples involved. I have to tell you, I feel like this is kind of a hit piece that you're doing on me right now, to be honest.
Whoa. Let's talk about that. Hold on a second.
Well, in a moment. I want to answer your question first. I feel like you're really putting me on trial here.
No, by no means. By no means. I think that that's an unfair allegation.
Okay. To answer your question, he had some questions that were sent to me. I think it was about 20 to 30 of them. Some of them were ridiculously leading, just ridiculously leading. And I said to him, I think you're going to need to phrase these more neutrally, or I'm not going to be able to answer them. I also sent them to a friend of mine, Glenn Fleischman, who is a very famous journalist, a very, very, very famous, well-regarded journalist, writes for The Economist. And he actually just laughed at the questions because he didn't find them ethical.
That's perfectly fair. Listen, last thing, let's address your allegation that this is a hit piece. The way that I take particular issue with, I have absolutely no horse in this race. When I announced I was going to be interviewing you, I received a deluge of emails saying the fact...
You went right to work, eh? just got to make sure that we're completely aware that this was in fact not a hit piece, and that's what I really, really want to talk about now.
That I was interviewing you alone and not someone in opposition to you was evidence that I was in the tank for the other side. And of course, I think you would disagree with that. All I'm doing is I spent many hours researching, and I don't want to be accused of not asking you the questions that others believe should absolutely be asked. I've not cut you off. I've presented you with a fair opportunity to answer every single claim, and I hope to have someone on with an opposing view next week or the week after to you, and they will be asked all of the same tough questions that you would want asked. So I take very significant issue with the allegation that this is in any way a hit piece. I have absolutely no preconceived notion of what right and wrong is on this particular issue. I'm open to hearing both sides, and I'm merely doing my job as a journalist.
Yeah. Sure. I would say, yeah, that's fine if you're going to monologue.
I'm sorry, if I'm going to monologue?
Did you cut off?
Brianna, you're breaking up. I don't know if you have a good connection. We got cut off. All we heard before you got interrupted was if I want to monologue.
You just told me, you gave me a long monologue about why you don't feel that this was an aggressive hit piece. What I would say to you is
Hey, James from the internet. Hello, James from the internet viewers. We're going through Dead Domain's brand new video they just did on Brianna Wu and all the receipts and all the stuff, and we've just reached the Gamergate part of the story. Can everyone go to twitch.tv/James from the internet? Give James from the internet a follow back. Thank you so much, friend. And if y'all have already seen this, I mean, if you haven't seen it, definitely please go subscribe and thumbs up and thank Dead Domain and all their hard work in putting this together, because it's very encompassing. We've been watching for an hour and we're only at Gamergate.
You've asked me like one question to present my side, and then you've asked me some very, very aggressive questions, you know, questioning my credibility, this and that. And I feel like most of what you've asked here has been very aggressive. I'm happy to answer that. I tried to answer these as aggressively as possible, but I wish we could spend as much time talking about the issues at hand rather than the controversy that Gamergate is trying to, you know, frankly sling mud with my reputation over.
This kind of reaction from Brianna is another staple, even against Kickstarter backers and Patreon subs who would question her later. She'd simply call them Gamergate supporters or abusers. I want to say that the divides between people from that time and the obvious agendas being pursued make digging into these topics incredibly difficult, because trying to find information on Brianna Wu or any of the other targets will bring up endless piles of assholes, referring to women as subhumans and SJWs. But on the less extreme fringes, there were still plenty of people who kept tabs on the inconsistencies in Brianna's story, which isn't easy because there are so many. Suffice to say, this video took a lot of digging. Like this Reddit thread where they note that they rarely saw people comment harassment on Brianna's Twitter despite her claiming. And that, despite claiming to have fled her home, Brianna was very clearly doing interviews, or at least appearing to, from her home soon after having fled. But as we can see from some of these interviews, the image of someone being forced to flee from her home by Gamergate is a shocking and compelling one. That sensationalism is another aspect of Brianna's story that has remained steadfast. Yet, like her stories about college, having degrees, about being a crime reporter, doesn't really hold up to much scrutiny. For example, there are several consistency issues with the way she tells the story of her being forced to flee, most notably elements from the interviews and articles she wrote within days of the doxing being inconsistent with the way she would tell the same story months later, or some elements being seemingly missing, like the idea she had been getting harassment for months leading up to the tweets, eventually just being simplified to the tweets being the lone catalyst for the exodus. If you can feel the creeping sensation of something just being off about Brianna's story, don't worry, plenty of other people noticed, because even back then she'd be caught lying and attempting to bait harassment towards herself personally, like this infamous post from her Steam forum account where she refers to herself in—
This is also weird because, like, this, I've never looked into this aspect of the story because I just took it for granted based on the articles that were coming out at the time that Brianna Wu was another woman on the internet that was being, you know, unfairly targeted and harassed during Gamergate. And I wouldn't even think that someone might actually be trying to position themselves within that intentionally.
Third person as a notable feminist and is very clearly trying to goad people into talking shit about her. Notable feminist, by the way, doing some real heavy lifting here. While forum posts and some articles did show Brianna's interest in progressive feminism and women's rights and representation issues, she wasn't particularly notable at this time for being a feminist, any more than she was notable ever for being an artist or a journalist. What am I saying? She still sells herself as all of these things, no matter how much she actually knows about any of this. I'm surprised at this point she doesn't call herself a chef because she made a TV dinner once and didn't burn the brownie. She likes to, let's say, stretch the truth, if that wasn't obvious by now. For example, like how she would depict threats against her life, even when the same threats had long been revealed to be jokes. After an obvious online troll, Jace Connors went on several tirades trying to challenge Brianna to a street race, Brianna continued to claim he was threatening her life. It would later be revealed that Jace was merely a troll character being played by comedian.
And I think, like, one of the biggest dangers of all this is you're going to be giving the trolls and a lot of horrifying people on the internet so much ammunition, right? Like if people can start pulling all this stuff apart, and even if they're coming from a place, I would say, of mutual respect and, you know, good faith, like David Pakman was there. And they're like, by the way, I just, you know, cursory glance into the post that was made, seems to be a reply from what I believe was an account that you yourself had created. So in a sense, was that really someone antagonizing you in that reply, or was that account that you were just replying to yourself from like a sock puppet account, and then being like, oh, I feel like this is adversarial and you're trying to now attack me the way the others have? And then it's like, no, not at all. Sorry. I just want to be completely clear. My intentions here are simply to find out what's going on. I don't really understand this, to be totally honest with you. It's, you know, it's a different world. Video games. Jan
Rankowski has an elaborate absurdist bit. I'm not saying it's a good bit, this all seems very stupid, but that doesn't change it being intended as a joke, and more importantly, that Brianna wasn't actually in real danger, and she knew this. Despite this revelation, Brianna would continue to hold up this joke as a legitimate threat on her life, even announcing she had contacted the FBI over it. She also appeared on the Sci-Fi Channel in an interview for the program The Internet Ruined My Life, where she cried over these very same jokers and how they'd been trying to kill her. The episode aired in 2016, well after the hoax had been exposed, by the way.
We spent about a week and a half out of our house, and at a certain point, you can't live out of a hotel forever.
Interestingly, this segment is actually directly at odds with a 2015 Inc. interview, which states that she spent the better part of a month, not just a week and a half on the run. Just one of the many ways her story kind of just changes over time when it comes to fleeing her house.
This man himself sent me a very specific, terrifying video. This is my car. Another bitch shit has crashed. Where he claimed he had crashed his car on the way to my house. It is the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Where he swears he's going to deliver justice to me in his own hands. It made me feel so helpless.
So, being as charitable as I can be, I'm willing to extend the graceful idea that Brianna might have misspoken or been rattled by the harassment and doxing. People get details mixed up, it happens. But as the inconsistencies between Brianna's stories and other evidence mounts, it gets a lot harder to be so charitable. And it's truly regrettable that nobody was willing or likely able to question her stories for fear of being aligned with a verifiable hate movement of antisocial weirdos like Gamergate. Because Brianna Wu's long history of having a persecution complex, which again we've seen in her college days and forums, truly came to the forefront in these months. The result is that now most of the journalism, using the term very loosely here, is from outlets like fucking Breitbart. But they are reporting on verifiable sources, so I have to rely on them for this nightmare. Meanwhile, many more progressive-leaning outfits were outright just okay having Brianna Wu just completely structure and create her own narratives with very little oversight, giving full control to her.
As a game dev myself, I can tell you that Wu made it harder to argue against the jackals supporting the gamer-making movement. I bet. I mean, this is actually really important that Dead Domain is coming at it from this angle as well, because I think there are times when, you know, liberals or leftists do have blind spots and might, you know, completely miss this part of the story, especially like, you know, related to how the harassment was being targeted.
To ostensibly weave whatever narrative she wanted to, and being that a lot of coverage of Gamergate wasn't from people actually inside the game industry, but mainstream publications looking to cover the sensationalism behind stories like women game devs forced to leave their house, there wasn't a lot of oversight or curtailing for Brianna's narratives. From a Jezebel article about harassment received from women in media where Brianna was interviewed, quote, "I had someone last week that made a video talking about how they're going to murder me," Wu added. "It's not just I'm going to kill Brianna. It's like a multi-minute rant about why they want to murder me, how. Their face is visible. I have their name and testimony from the people who know them and how unbalanced they are. This person lives 15 minutes from my house." Wu called the police, which she's had to do numerous times since Gamergate blew up. To her amazement, even this particular threat hasn't resulted in an arrest. This is what I want to emphasize to you. As much as you can have something going for you with death threats, I do, she said. I have a very high profile case. There's so much media attention. I have the ear of the police. They have every reason to want to solve this crime, but at the same time, nothing has happened, even giving them as much information as I have. This article was published January 29th, 2015. In May, just a few months after that article she wrote was published, she had an interview with the Mary Sue where she blamed law enforcement for not acting after receiving a death threat. This would lead to the Ohio prosecutor's office coming out and saying that not only had they not received any reports from Wu, but they had all been forced to waste time and resources after the Mary Sue article led a bunch of people to calling and yelling at them to take action for crimes that Brianna Wu had apparently not actually reported to them. Other tidbits from Brianna's Gamergate odyssey would eventually emerge, including leaked chat logs from Zoe Quinn's Crash Override network, where several other prominent creators are seen talking about Brianna behind her back in derisive tones, featuring other notable personalities like Peter Kaufman and Ian Miles Chong. Let me put bigger quotations around the word notable. There's a lot of depicting Brianna as a loose cannon who was prone to flying off the handle.
Yeah, she said and done a few very damaging things to her own cause. We have to be tactical about this. Oh my God.
And interestingly, at the time, inserting herself and taking over conversations about minorities, particularly when it came to transgender.
Clean up your room.
Because while Brianna was still depicting herself,
White 185 things giving a tier 1 sub to Samson.
As a cis woman, pretty much the entire world was able to piece together that she was trans, even her allies. One other strange and forgotten piece of Brianna's story is this post on her blog where she claims a former Gamergater sent her an email apologizing for how Brianna was harassed. "I am so sorry about the way you have been treated. You are a beautiful, talented, intelligent woman who is worth 1 million of those people involved in Gamergate, myself included. I am no longer involved in it. In fact, I may just work against. I know, though, it is time for me to stand down from my pedestal and listen to women, to let them steer culture and not resist the betterment and balance they will bring." End quote. Before you ask, this is not the only time Brianna would proudly assert that some unverifiable source just completely agrees with her positions with fawning adulation. This is something that she still does today. From a source I would speak to later, she also does this with modern political sources, saying she has meetings, for example, with high-level Democrats, which she does on social media without usually mentioning specifically who. From an anonymous source who worked with Brianna, quote, "She never gave me any specifics about the things that she did. I think in part because she knew that I would ask some questions you might not know to ask if you haven't done that kind of work before. So she was always very vague. She was like, I look at polls, I coordinate with other organizations. I just got so tired of hearing her claiming, I look at polls and I'm constantly talking to high-level Democratic officials and I have meetings. And it's like, where is the evidence of any of that?" End quote. So is she just lying? or just coincidentally talks to more unverifiable people than anybody else on the planet. And lest we forget, by this point she had fabricated Lauren Mallovy, and would in these years do the same thing again with Natalie O'Brien. Don't go anywhere. We'll talk about Natalie in a second. You might ask, why would someone go through all this? And the only answer I can offer is because it turned Brianna Wu from somebody nobody knew about, working on a game that frankly didn't look that good, to someone that needed your support and the support of gaming outlets when that game came out. Again, in sharp contrast to Zoe and Anita, Brianna continued to insert herself into all kinds of online drama, drumming up conflict with Total Biscuit, causing a row over an article about how Samus from the Metroid series is actually trans, and plenty of other small one-off online
Just like for
scuffles that
comparison, people like Zoe Quinn were getting so much targeted harassment. They were being being forced to move from one place to another. And it wasn't just them, it was anyone associated with them. So we're talking like friends who spoke out. Like there was this game developer called Phil Fish, and he basically made this adorable kind of 3D, 2D spinning game that was like a ton of fun. It was a puzzle game. It was a blast to play. But he was so harassed simply for speaking up. Fez, thank you, Fez. If you haven't played Fez, yeah, go support Fez. You know, I think it still gets money to him. But all he did was speak up and talk about how it was unfair, the amount of targeting that Zoe was receiving. Was so heavily harassed that he just completely stopped making video games and has disappeared in terms of having a public profile on the internet since then. So people were like avoiding it to the greatest extents they could being associated with anything Gamergate related because of how intense the online targeted harassment was. Except for Brianna Wu, it seems, in this case, or at least that's what's been presented so far. Like it seems like Brianna Wu was more than willing to bring more attention to, hey, I'm being targeted, I'm being harassed. I need to do interviews about this. I need to do press about this.
I don't really care about reiterating when the point is she very obviously just relished the spotlight. And with that spotlight, especially after fleeing her home, she soon garnered the scrutiny of online communities like Kiwi Farms. As you might expect for a woman in tech, depicting herself as a brave fighter against vitriolic online harassers who had been covered by dozens of outlets by this point, Brianna's Patreon popped off quite a bit, especially considering one of the main selling points for Patreon was depicted as that money going towards someone at her game company, Giant Space Cat, being hired to specifically deal with harassment. Like the death threats she had cited from people who had publicly admitted to be hoaxes. Let's not put that aside for now. Again, I'm not saying Brianna never got harassed or doxxed. I am stating a fact. She had a history of embellishing the danger she was in. Again, think back to the saga of leaving her house. Then on March 9th, 2015, an anonymous Medium post speculated that instead of using part of the Patreon money to pay the aforementioned Twitter harassment specialist, Natalie O'Brien, the Medium post instead posited the theory that Natalie didn't actually exist. Brianna had made her up and simply pocketed the money. Already, this should sound familiar. Brianna is a liar, we've established that, but we've also established a history of evidence that she's a liar. Of course, she's never come out to admit to making up a girlfriend in college, making up harassing emails, making up entire people. So if at this point you still want to give the benefit of the doubt to say, maybe she did hire Natalie, maybe she didn't make her up, I want you to ask yourself, what are the odds of one person having multiple examples of even maybe making up people to entirely agree with or support them, and having strong evidence that they've done this multiple times? And if you have any remaining doubts as to whether Brianna is a liar or these are just the most coincidental coincidences ever, by the end of the video, I aim to lay all of those doubts to rest. From the Medium post, quote, I initially became suspicious when having a conversation with a local friend involved in IT who had previously a business dealing with Brianna. When I mentioned that I donated to her
so she knows Peter Coffin. True.
Do a little more digging on the veracity of her claims. In doing so, I noticed
all
several
about
claims that
the
seemed
old Peter
dubious.
Coffin
The one
lore.
that concerns me most
There's
is of
so much
Natalie
of it.
O'Brien because it is a purely financial matter and does not involve
Don't hear from
subjective
them
ideas
anymore.
about politics or social justice. Simply enough, Brianna Wu has likely made over $30,000 over the course of her patron's existence, and there is no evidence that the person she claims to be paying the money to, or any other person filling such a role, exists. In reaching out to fellow Bostonians in the gaming and coding community, I've not found a single person who knows a Natalie O'Brien.
You know what's funny is that they were just ahead of their time, because now it's just like a normalized thing. I don't know if you saw that, like Mark Zuckerberg is basically like, oh yes, human beings, most the average American has in terms of friendships, usually about 3 friends, but using new digital AI friends through Meta, you'll be able to have as many friends as you need. And then I was like, the fuck is this future? It's like, you don't need friends. You don't need to talk to human beings. You can talk to ones and zeros, you know, that are not actually replying to you. They're just trying to think of what is the best approximated answer that could make the most sense in the conversation. But yeah, how does that feel?
Further, in reaching out to people who have supposedly worked at Giant Space Cat Games with Natalie O'Brien, the only response I got from someone who had never heard of Natalie O'Brien or a pregnant employee at Giant Space Cat at all. When I contacted other members of the Giant Space Cat and Brianna Wu's professional circle, I was met with ignored emails and immediate blocks on Twitter. The lack of an answer is even more damning than simply hearing that the employees had never heard of Natalie O'Brien. It's one thing to not be aware of someone you work with, but it seems like an incredible overreaction to, instead of simply saying if you don't know the person or not, circle your wagons and refuse to speak on the subject. The only person in Brianna's social or professional circle who's been willing to speak publicly on the subject of Natalie O'Brien is former contract employee Emma Clarkson, and she also doubts Natalie's existence. Now, Brianna did respond, and after a few back and forth comments, she immediately turned to a regular deflection, saying, quote, "Look, I was willing to entertain outside chances you were legit, even though the odds were astronomical this was Gamergate. But give me a break. This is the adult world. I wasn't born yesterday, or as we said in Mississippi growing up, I didn't fall off the turnip truck. If you're legit, write us. We'll check your name against our records and have a phone call."
And we just don't have this in Vancouver. Canada, I'm sorry, there's nothing I could be like, as we say in Vancouver, BC, syrup. Like, we don't have an old-timey saying,
With the person you think doesn't exist, but you're not legit. End of line. Oh, sick Tron reference, Brie. That nerd reference is definitely gonna age super well, even though it's only said in the movies by two villains. First in the 1982 Steven Lisberger classic when the Master Control Program is trying to extort Ed Dillinger, and second in the 2011 follow-up Tron Legacy when Castor gets blown up by Clue. But
I don't remember the
Tron references
movies,
aside, there's still no real evidence Natalie O'Brien ever worked at Giant Space Cat. Even at the time, she wasn't featured in any of the photos posted of the studio and would have been one of, if not the only employee to not have any social media presence, despite apparently being specifically hired as a social media consultant to, according to Brianna, work full-time to run interference for the harassment and death threats Brianna was attracting. This lack of any representation and most notably no photographic evidence of any kind should ring familiar to Lauren Malovies. So with all this information at your disposal, draw what conclusions you will. Nobody ever talks about Tron 2.0, the first-person shooter made by Monolith, the same people who made Fear and Condemned. I'd rather talk about Tron 2.0 than Brianna. They had a Game Boy Advance spin-off. Had first-person full 3D sequences where you got to fly a recognizer and a light tank.
Look it up.
You fly a recognizer in first person. Before I move on, I need to talk about Chloe Segal. I want to be clear, I do not want to sensationalize Brianna's relationship to Chloe. But during this period, trans game developer Chloe Segal had a public falling out with Brianna, claiming that Brianna ruined her life and refused to help her. Chloe sadly ended up taking her life in DMs that would later be leaked. I think Brianna comes across as less than sympathetic in the midst of Chloe breaking down and pleading with her. Again, I want to be very clear here. I bring this up mostly so that there isn't 1,000 comments talking about this piece of internet lore and trying to blame it on Brianna. I think at the end of the day, Chloe was a deeply troubled person and didn't get the comfort and support all people should have when going through some really hard shit. And when people feel helpless and like there's nowhere else to turn, sometimes it can end very badly. And I also won't pretend to know what it's like to have someone do that and then spend the rest of your life wondering if there was more you could have done. I imagine that is what Brianna struggles with, and she doesn't need any other kind of invective to deal with around this particular issue if that's the case. What I can say is that suicide is never the answer, and you always have someone who will go out of their way to help you, so don't be afraid to reach out. Nobody is a burden, so don't be afraid to let others help you if you need it. As I've illustrated, there are plenty of points throughout Brianna's story that seem embellished or fabricated, but that doesn't mean she deserves to be blamed for something horrible like this. And I want to go on record, I don't think she should be. There are valid parts of Brianna's story to call attention to. This isn't one of them. And like I said, I bring it up specifically to stop any speculation that might happen in the comments or questions about why I don't explain it later. So with that out of the way, let's get back to some Gamergate-related happenings. Again, as loath as I am to source these dorks, sites like Bounding Into Comics were some of the only people noting Zoe Quinn's displeasure at Brianna's announcement in 2021 that Brianna had begun working on a Gamergate TV series. And I think that this TV series, which thankfully never materialized and sounded awful, consisting entirely of fictional characters, is actually a really good capstone to understand how Brianna fits into Gamergate. Where people like Zoe and Anita tried to move on and have been vocal that they don't want to keep being defined by this period in their lives, Brianna continues to find ways to bring her involvement back into the spotlight and even attempts to continue monetizing it as part of her creative endeavors, like the ill-fated TV show. And if you thought Brianna, Zoe, and Anita had some kind of kindred bond, think again, as in these 2022 DMs I've received, Brianna shit-talks her fellow Gamergate targets, accusing them of being bad about trans people and trying to hog the spotlight, which is ironic, considering all Brianna did to be defined by Gamergate. But still, she didn't want to just be defined by Gamergate, as she writes in this self-aggrandizing 2015 article in The Guardian. Quote, "I was at a bar a few weeks ago having drinks with a well-known journalist. Do you think my career is going to be defined by Gamergate? I asked him worriedly. He looked me dead in the eye and said, I think it depends on if you can pivot. At some point, you need to use your raised profile to move on to new things. I'm taking that advice and pivoting. I'm sure the misogynist fringe of Gamergate will continue to make our lives hell in any way they can. They'll continue to threaten me and other women, intimidate and bully us, but at a certain point, we just have to get back to work. Besides, we make games, they make internet comments. Who really has the power?" Indeed, so let's see what Brianna would pivot to next. I'll give you a hint, it wasn't making more video games.
Oh, we're finally at Rebellion Pack. Wow.
It should be no surprise by now that Brianna's abrasive tendencies would isolate many people who should have been her natural allies. Even in those leaked group chats, we saw people seeing her as a loose cannon. And since Gamergate, she continued on her same trend of pushing away anyone who didn't fall in line, denying accountability and stretching the truth to the breaking point. As a result, when I reached out to people who used to work with her, they didn't have very many good things to say about her. We will get to their testimony more as we continue through Brianna's timeline, but here's a sneak peek. At their request, all interviewees have chosen to remain anonymous. From somebody who spent time working with Brianna during Progressive Victory. Quote, I would never work with her again, and I would advise other people not to work with her, because I do think she's the kind of person who will use somebody and then spit them out the second they aren't useful or not willing to bootlick. My impression was she was going for people who at the very least wouldn't question her narratives. I despise the time I spent working with her. I've never despised working with someone else in my career. She was very incompetent. She seemed to lie a lot in a professional capacity. It was bizarre and off-putting, and I didn't like it, and I don't know anyone who worked underneath her or beside her who wound up having a positive experience. End quote. So with those to look forward to, we still have to get through Brianna's next chapter after Gamergate, running for Congress. Twice, technically. Brianna's political ambitions came on a wave of progressive sentiment that emerged after Trump's 2016 electoral win. And by several interviews, she seems to have aligned more with what she would eventually call the radical leftists. I want to call quick attention to this early interview Brianna did in 2017, where when asked about her roadmap other people should follow for getting involved in politics, she advocates running it like one of her startups. We remember her startups, right? It's also very funny that she would mention getting a lawyer to look at FEC rules when her campaign would fail to meet those standards for.
Oh, that makes sense. If you're getting like hundreds of thousands of dollars from your parents to do startups and you think that's how, like, you know, business and capitalism works. It's just like, oh yeah, no, I have a lot of experience. So, you know, I've had a very successful startup before. You mean you were gifted hundreds of thousands of dollars? That, I mean, okay, yeah, sure. Now the system's going to work the exact same way.
Filing. But that's a little bit later. Again, however, we see Brianna's ever-present overconfidence, much like she took on the game industry with no experience and started an animation startup with no experience. She pursued a congressional run with no actual political experience, even as a commentator. Unless you count a variety of articles with very little oversight, she had managed to get on a variety of websites in the years since 2014. I'd also not be doing my due diligence if I didn't mention her self-designed campaign logo. Like, all of those years in art school and being an artist had to be good for something, right?
I forgot about that.
Well, alas. Relatively fresh from her Gamergate spotlight, Brianna got some press coverage for this congressional run, but it wouldn't translate to anything being actually done at the polls. In fact, she didn't make it past the Democratic primaries, meaning she didn't even get enough support to be put on an election ballot. She also forgot to file with the FEC or Federal Election Commission, as these publicly available documents show. And you might ask, well, even if she didn't have a lot of experience and the campaign didn't get very far, maybe she had good ideas. Her now infamous moon rocks tweet might provide some insight, where she pontificates about the tactical value of moon rocks dropped from the moon to Earth. I really, really want to think this is just an incredibly deadpan joke. That's not exactly her style and would be odd to make during an attempted campaign. For further proof of her political insights, I'd point you to this campaign appearance she made in Massachusetts.
I forgot about that. I actually knew about that one because there was a while back when I was like, I think that's the one thing that maybe Brianna Wu shares with Moonlord, right? Is their desire to control and conquer the moon. Because it's important. It has lots of minerals. It could be a powerful military base. Who could stop a nation that has the moon, right?
Starts by selling herself as having spent her entire life in software engineering before jumping right into talking about Russia hacking the US and our infrastructure. Again, she wasn't really into software engineering and certainly wasn't for her whole life.
I've spent my entire life working in software engineering. Wow. If you've been watching the news at all today, you can see that we're having quite a few problems with Russia, information warfare, bot warfare, having our infrastructure hacked. There's even a story last week that came out that was showing how actually Russia had penetrated our power plants here in the United States.
She essentially humble brags here about having a Law and Order episode based on her life next, and then brings up that she worked for Hillary Clinton's campaign. Now, this is an aside that we will talk about more once we get to Brianna's current crop of podcast appearances, including her Dollcast podcast. But one thing I've noticed is that when speaking off the cuff, Brianna loves to name drop famous people, even when it has little to no bearing on the conversation. So just put a pin in that. This was one of the first times I'd actually seen Brianna speak, and it was really a moment where everything snapped into place for me. She talks a bit about how we need to get big, unaccountable, dark money groups out of politics, which would be very funny in a minute. All of the questions at the beginning are bizarrely given by her husband Frank, where she mentions also some of her friends she knew served in the Iraq War.
So today is the 15th anniversary of the invasion in Iraq. 4,000 Americans died, 100,000 Iraqis, maybe more, died. I know that you knew people that had served over there, many of whom had sacrificed a lot. What are your thoughts on this?
I think more than anything else has happened in my lifetime. The Iraq War is really what defined me as a person. And I'm going to tear up here because I had people I deeply cared about that gave their lives in that war. And it was 15 years ago today that we invaded Iraq.
Were these people real? Use your best judgment at this point. I'd honestly like to give Brianna any kind of leeway, especially when she's telling anecdotal stories about people who suffered in the war, but I can't, especially after literally everything she's done. But I want to talk about Frank. See, essentially she uses him as a surrogate for fielding questions throughout, and actually takes one from the crowd towards the end of the video, but it comes off as odd and stilted. Why not just take questions from the crowd the whole time, if that's who you're here to engage? The answer is probably because for Brianna, that no longer makes it a controlled environment where she can bounce between pre-decided talking points like her Iraq war friends and Gamergate harassment experience. And without those talking points, she's not able to name drop and verify her experience as much to a crowd who doesn't know who she is. And also because when she answers a question off book, it goes something like this.
Also, continuing the conversation about the climate change issue.
Absolutely.
A lot of the conversations around renewable energies, looking for hopefully best available technologies.
I've seen nano machines that have the potential to solve some of this. I was actually on a jet the other day and talking to someone about this. I want to tell you, I am in Silicon Valley a lot, and I speak at MIT a lot. I've never seen a solution yet for that, but I do know we've got to really double down and quadruple down on our science to get us there. Trump is slashing the NHS. We're slashing scientific funding. So it frustrates me that my industry, technology, is often seeking out how to do better shaders for guns in video games or doing things that seem kind of superfluous to me.
Citing nanomachines. Congressional run. This was in 2018, and her candidacy, as I mentioned, would go nowhere, despite reportedly raising over $200,000 in funds according to Open Secrets. According to that same website, the funding source seems to be pretty divided between donations and cash funding, not unlikely from Frank Wu. Yet, in 2020, Brianna would run again and receive over $200,000 in donations for Brianna Wu for Congress, including contributions from both her campaign and from Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, who is running for Congress as well. I'll talk more about their link in a moment. The thing is, Brianna didn't even make it as far into the primaries as last time, dropping out and citing the ongoing COVID pandemic at the time. In her traditional Brianna fashion we've come to know and loathe by now, in a Medium post that signaled the end of her so far final political race, she went on to detail a very likely fictionalized, though still sensationalized story that, similarly to her story years earlier, would just so happen to perfectly represent a moment in her life and culture as a whole that she can illustrate to make a point. Think back to that story about seeing the little girl on her motorcycle. But when you look at the actual expenses of Brianna's candidacy, I can't help but ask the question, then where did almost $300,000 in donations go? Which might give you even more deja vu to Brianna's other projects and suspicious monetary incidents like the Kickstarter money that went to a non-existent person, and of course her startup at 19, that went nowhere. In fact, when you count up some estimates between the combined campaign costs of about $500,000, $200,000 for the animation studio, and an estimate of more than $400,000 for Revolution 60, Brianna's hit-to-miss ratio is like over $1 million in expenses across her career with almost nothing meaningful to show for it, let alone revenue to reflect the expenditures. Now, thankfully, much of what's been spent by the 2020 Wu campaign is publicly available on the FEC website. There are a handful of odd expenditures that might raise eyebrows, like the contributions giving Frank Wu almost $900 for travel expenses. Two other big payees, the Insurrection Inc. and Casale Keller Consulting, were paid in the several thousands and are consulting firms that purport to be against big money in Washington. So I guess that's not big money by Washington standards. From everyone I've spoken to, it seems like Brianna has mostly made it as far as she has by simply faking it until she makes it, relying on the trust of others to not question her or her narratives. From an anonymous source who worked with Brianna, specific details have been withheld to preserve anonymity. Quote, hearing her selling herself.
Sorry, I missed the Twitch ones as well. Moda00000, thank you for the Prime. D. Der Kizzle, thank you very much for the Prime as well. And Quite 185, thank you for the gift. I appreciate that.
Her pitch was basically, well, I'm different because I have actual experience. And that was appealing because it seems like there's such a lack of experience-based perspective in the online political world. She spoke about her experiences in a way that did not initially set off my bullshit alarm. At least for quite a while, we had very similar political perspectives. I think I was blinded by the trust that she actually did so many of the things she claims to have done. Over time, I started to get more suspicious, and seeing how she was responding to certain controversies, I tried to do my own research on who she is and what she's actually accomplished in any of the organizations and roles she's claimed to have been successful in. With her, I was looking for reasons to believe she was who I thought she was. I wasn't looking for dirt. I was hoping I would look it up and find evidence of what she's claimed to have done. I even said that to, I said, hey, I'm getting the feeling increasingly like she either hasn't done the things she says she's done, or she's really bad at communicating it. I don't have anything concrete about her. I've looked for it, and it's always just stories, and just trust me. And because of her attempts to appeal to a more centrist right-wing audience and her now trademark inability to take any criticism, at least from the left, Brianna Wu has spent the last few years making more enemies than friends. Because more than anything she does now, Brianna excels at alienating and pushing away people. And at this point, I don't think she can help it. Like the film project she was brought on, and then like a month later, they released a public statement distancing themselves from her.
Oh no.
Now, publicly, she's been adamantly vicious about her stances on trans healthcare and her support of Israel's ongoing civilian genocide in Gaza. But she likes to couch this all in a pragmatic approach, that she's a serious political operative who really looks at the landscape and knows which way the wind is blowing. But behind closed doors, or at least in DMs, she's a bitch of a different color. One that seems to relish being mean-spirited and tries constantly to wrangle others to fall in line with what she wants. One of the more notable examples had to do with her playing the role of a high school mean girl in leaked DMs about Bonnie, a trans woman formerly with TYT, when Bonnie was early in transition. In those same leaked DMs, Brianna would agree that pronouns had been pushed to insanity and say Bonnie looked like a transvestite, while agreeing that non-binary people were partly to blame for the anti-trans social shift. This, despite previous stances where she claimed to unequivocally support non-binary people. You see, these texts are just vicious bullying. By the way, there's no excuse for them. These DMs came out in 2023, preceding the more broad right-wing appeal she's been aiming for. But they very publicly showed Brianna to be, at best, someone who advocated for things publicly she didn't believe in privately, and at worst, was an opportunistic liar. While Brianna would try and save some face by saying the leaked photos were out of context, and limply try and take some form of accountability when she's actually backed into a corner, this kind of mean girl gossip is a common occurrence with her. In other DMs, like this leaked Signal chat, she calls out other activists like Alejandra Caraballo as toxic, citing everyone Brianna knows who's worked with her. In that same breath, she accuses Aaron Reed of being cut from a toxic cloth and says that a group she's part of lacks integrity. We saw earlier how she shit-talked Destiny, but that's not the only person she worked with that she'd be disparaging of, as she, in these same Signal chats, would claim Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks has shitty opinions and called into question his choices like a presidential run. I've redacted the names here, so if Brianna watches this, she might just know who these are from, or she might have just lost track of all the people.
I was going to say, Jake might not know about that, because if he did, he'd probably be like, oh, wait, what? Because that's the one thing you can't do. You can't talk shit about Cenk, not if you're working for Cenk.
He's threatened and disparaged and talked shit about. I think that's probably the more likely answer. Either way, I received several messages and DMs from other prominent members of the trans and queer community interacting directly with Brianna. These texts show who Brianna really is, how she tries to pressure others to fall in line with her political ambitions. She constantly tries to leverage others to agree with her, never attempting to be sympathetic to their point of view, if it won't gain her something. On a personal level, I think these DMs show a genuine lack of empathy on Brianna's part, where she seems so blinded by her my way or the highway attitude, she ignores the experiences and ideas of others consistently. So by now we have a pretty consistent portrait of Brianna as someone who will bully others, shift blame, and deny most accountability, all the while touting experience and connections she really seems to just not have. It shouldn't surprise you that she is also trying to engage in hiring people to gather information on who she deems her political opponents. And I have the texts and emails to prove it. From another anonymous source, in 2023, Brianna attempted to hire someone to compile information on political targets like Jackson Hinkle, offering thousands of dollars for essentially a bounty for people she didn't agree with. I do want to know—
You could have saved so much money and just waited for the internet to do its thing. There's a bounty of free stuff out there. It's pretty well documented what a grifter Hinkle is.
That oppo research, or oppositional research, is a pretty common practice in Washington, D.C. political and lobbyist circles. But the way Brianna claims to go about it here is—
Why Jackson Hinkle? Because Jackson Hinkle is probably the largest political account on Twitter that is consistently, like, as a grift, he pivoted pretty strongly post October 7th, pretending that he was like one of the largest defenders of Palestinian rights, that this was the biggest cause, that he was going to speak out against Western imperialism and the war crimes of Benjamin Netanyahu. When again, there are posts from like I think as little as a year prior to that where he was praising Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that he's willing to work with Putin to do the interpolar alliance that the world needs to take on the imperialist scum of the United States, like all that weird, typical Hinkle bullshit. And then, yeah, it's obscenely gross for him to start becoming basically a war profiteer, or sorry, a genocide profiteer in this case, and just continue to like put stuff on blast as if he's someone who cares so much about the Palestinian plight. When he went to the student protests, they rejected him just walking up and being able to speak at the student protests, specifically because of the fact that he's a white supremacist and has a whole bunch of like fucking rampant homophobia, transphobia, all this kind of shit. And he got so mad that he went and recorded a video about how they were all F slurs. It's like, oh, all those woke F slurs won't let me speak. They don't care about the they don't care about Palestinians. They don't care about anything. They're all just soy, blah, blah, blah.
It's just so bizarre. I can't imagine anybody normally familiar with oppositional research and how dossiers like that are put together would look at this and be like, yeah, that's a completely normal way to go about business.
So I just love how she's like, I need a dossier. I'm sure you've heard of them, right? They're very, very well known in politics. I know politics. I am very, very big expert in politics. This is my field. This is my expertise. I know about dossiers and hit pieces. You need to assemble. I want this to be like CIA tier, all right? We're thinking, usually when I buy one of these, I spend about $25,000, but that's getting it directly from government officials. So I might be able to barter with you. We could lower it down to say like $2,000. You can give me this incredibly damaging dossier.
She even went so far as to consult her lawyer for how to pay for the person she was trying to commission. I actually really like this letter from her lawyer, by the way, because it's written in the nicest legalese way. That seems like the lawyer is just trying to say,
well, it's clearly permissible for a foreign national to do research for us. Then we determine how to do that research. There's never been a case where a PAC or campaign has paid a foreign national to disseminate communications, since they'd have a say in what they're literally saying, paid for by the PAC. So I'd recommend against this as proposed. Is there potentially a way to keep this research internal? Then we disseminate communications? This is ultimately their risk as well.
Hey, don't. Now, being the masterful political operator she is,
the legal advice
if you need more evidence that Brianna was
this.
behind this, she said this in a Twitter post in November 2023. In other messages, she claims to have already done this in the past, paying quite a sum for dirt on people who aren't named, though she gives an estimate between $5,000 and $20,000. She's previously paid for these dossiers, leading me to think there's been multiple? Now, is this Brianna weaving another strand in her ever-expanding web of bullshit? I don't know, honestly. If she was willing to go far enough to consult a lawyer on this, I don't see why she wouldn't have paid for this kind of thing in the past. If it was revealed that Brianna did intend to use these dossiers for blackmail or extortion, which is honestly the only reason I could see her doing this, it would have been insanely illegal. As not only is blackmail illegal, but Brianna likely would have been using funds from Progressive Victory and or Rebellion PAC. But
that's
with
really
Brianna,
bad.
I have no idea if all of this is bullshit. Like, she could have absolutely just been lying to this person and giving them inflated hopes for something that never would have materialized in the first place. And I can't help but wonder again, why? Brianna is not an elected rep. She's not even running for anything. She has a cushy job where she seems to barely do anything, but also can't stand opposition and loves to target people who disagree with her. Was she doing this for blackmail? Was she trying to extort someone? Why Jackson Hinkle? There are so many other questions that this leads us to, but the ineffable conclusion is Brianna is a snake who seems to see herself as some masterful political manipulator. I want to preface the last few sections of this video with these DMs and accounts of Brianna behind the scenes, because I think along with everything else we've dug through together by now, they paint a cohesive picture of who Brianna is. And even with all the plastic surgery she loves to show off, like Dorian Gray, that illustration is anything but pretty. See, modern Brianna Wu isn't just someone who tries to force others behind the scenes to step in line with her while making snide jokes she thinks nobody is listening to. She's also taken, as I've mentioned several times now, a broad approach to trans ideology in an attempt to endear herself to more conservative minds. This includes hanging out with noted racist and white supremacist leaner Lauren Southern as the two checked out Brianna's Porsche collection. I need to mention this so you don't forget that Brianna is still fucking incredibly rich, apparently, as she continues to talk about and try to represent the struggles of a community that overwhelmingly isn't.
Wait,
Speaking of being
hold on, wait, is this real? Girls, shut the fuck up. You're attacking me for having 4 Porsches. Why do you need so many Porsches? Yes, absolutely I would. Okay? Like, unless you are some person who knows so much about these vehicles that you're restoring them and that this is your passion day in, day out. You know, it's just like with my own 2 hands, I want to restore these old cars and I do it as a benefit to the Porsche community and I work really handed. Like, who needs 4 Porsches? You don't need 1 Porsche. 4. I don't need to read the rest of this. Just starting with, you're attacking me for having 4 Porsches. Yes, nothing more is needed.
Of a community or
that's ridiculous.
Brianna publicly came out as trans in 2014, and collectively, everyone just kind of went, yeah, we know. And along the ride, there's been no shortage of fun tweets. Remember the KKK one? Notably, she's also buddied up to Richard Hanania. Now, Richard is your garden variety pseudo-intellectual who likes to use flowery prose to make basic observations about society seem profound.
I hate this genre of people on the internet. I'll be totally frank with you. Like every single time you just get a reply with someone who you know has to like correct their posture before they begin typing. Well, sir, doth you hath made a mistake if I check. This happens to be, but a fallacy, not most logical, say I. You're just like, oh my God, you fucking Dr. Seuss-esque motherfucker sitting there so proud, so virtuous, just getting so excited just to be, ha-ha, my intellectual superiority. It seems that I have a triple-digit IQ. And you're like, cool, neat, fun stuff. I have been destroyed, sir. Congratulations.
He's like a living version of those Facebook memes with someone's face chained to their phone, except he's also...
Yeah, he's also a Nazi. That's the other thing about this like particular genre, again, strain of humans on the internet who like to do this shit, is that like it's only a matter of replies. Like that's why it's not even worth what little calories you burn, you know, typing. It's not worth that to sit there and actually grant them an audience, because you're eventually just going to get to, what's that? Oh, skull measuring. Interesting. Yes, have you heard of race and IQ? Have you heard of how there are different races that actually have lower IQ levels? I bet you haven't looked into this. Have you actually seen this? Because this is something that apparently everyone is frightened to speak about. For of course we were just gonna get to phrenology. It just seems like a matter. There's got to be like some law on the internet where someone starts you know, their diction with doth, and then like, you know, in a couple of minutes you're gonna be doing race science with one of these fucking Nazis.
Racist. He's written positively in the past about race science and eugenics, but most telling, I feel, about Richard was the time he shared a video of Grand Theft Auto 5 and thought it was maybe a real terrorist attack in Los Angeles. He deleted it, but unfortunately the internet doesn't forget. I've always found the best way to explain what someone believes is to let them say it themselves. To that end, I've listened now to over a dozen hours of Brianna's various appearances on shows like Trigonometry and The Dollcast to bring you her opinions in her own words without the Twitter character count. Now let's talk about The Dollcast. In 2024, Brianna attempted not to just rebrand herself, but craft a rebranded trans rights movement. Not my words. This is the description of The Dollcast, a podcast featuring 4 trans women. Quote, Dollcast is the trans rights reboot, less extreme, more thoughtful, and willing to have fearless conversations. As of writing, this podcast has been around for about 6 months and has less than 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. It's a wonder why when trans rights are constantly under attack by conservatives, and the only conversations Brianna seems to fearlessly care about is with dickheads like Richard Hanania. But more than her personal quirks, I want to talk about Dollcast because it represents Brianna's modern trans rights takes as well. And by which I mean it's essentially a group of incredibly sheltered and privileged women talking shit about anyone they don't feel adequately passes. They're purity tests for who really is or isn't transgender. Brianna also has a preoccupation with targeting non-binary people, and particularly trans-masked and trans-masked non-binary people buying into explicit TERF talking points, with no pushback from the other hosts.
That trans ad that is playing, I live in Massachusetts, and it is on the air every 4 seconds. I was walking out of the bathroom at the movie theater the other day, and this ad comes on the air, and it's got like a trans woman with a very deep voice, and then it shows, Rachel Levine, and then it shows a bunch of drag queens, then it goes into, Kamala Harris wants gender-affirming surgery for prisoners, and then it ends with the tagline like Trump is for us, Kamala is for they them. It's using these caricatures of trans women as drag queens, and then using us to scare the public, and then linking like a bunch of ideas together, like drag queens, trans women, non-binary people into the soup to basically make people hate us. And it's a really dispiriting thing to see an election about, this explosion.
I mean, that's on Trump, no? On the Trump team? Like, again, yeah, it's not a surprise to me that fascists are going to attack vulnerable communities and groups and dehumanize them. That's what fascists do. That's why they have to be destroyed. That's like kind of the basis for all of it.
Of very young children that are non-binary. I've got a really good friend of mine. He was telling me with the class, they were having a coming out day, and like half the class was raising their hand, not saying, hi, I'm gay or lesbian, but I'm non-binary. And it's not that I'm saying I don't think that they're going through something real there. I'm saying that just pragmatically, if you've got armies of these kids coming out in schools, it is scaring the parents.
But maybe she's got some incisive political commentary to offer, what with having 2 congressional campaigns. If you thought that, those notions should be quickly dispelled. Episode 1 sees her basically blaming Democrats kowtowing to radical progressives for trans visibility, and in a roundabout way blames gender activists for the conservative victory and their fixation on criminalizing transness.
like all 5 of us agree that this maximalist view on trans issues, this isn't what we want from the Democratic Party. What I find really frustrating is, you know, I'm a little older than y'all are. In the trans movement, like how we got all these rights was going very slowly, piece by piece, and getting buy-in from the wider public. Like something I tweeted out last week was a copy of my Virginia birth certificate, which has been changed after I got GRS to female, right? That is an accommodation that was put into law. It took time. There was buy-in from the public. What I think is...
Oh, goddamn, Tigwig, thank you for all the gifted subs. Hey, 10 of you in the Twitch chat just got gifted subs. I wish I had Chico to show you. I'm Chico-less. Chico is with mom right now, so unfortunately it's just silly old me. But hey, that 10 of you just got a sub, so you should be really thankful that Tigwig is so generous. Yeah.
Happened in the last 5 years is a lot of the trans activists have convinced Democratic lawmakers of this maximalist vision of trans liberation that essentially comes to, it's a bunch of policy positions that turn the public against us.
Yes, it's the gender activists advocating for their rights in healthcare, and not at all the pocket industry of conservatives dedicated to painting a target on a marginalized group, as the Democrats did literally nothing to stem the tide of hate. You just, oh, you're such a good political maverick, Brianna.
Oh, and I've had so many conversations with people. They don't like Trump, but they don't like the Democratic elitists more. They hate us more. They hate progressives more. They hate the people that announce their pronouns more. They hate the people that do land acknowledgements more. Culture in the Democratic Party that I've had a front seat to. And this is how it works. Someone will go to a focus group and they will sit down and say, well, if you want to talk to black people, here's how you do it. Use these words. You want to talk to women? Go use these words. You want to talk to Latinos? Use these words. And what ends up coming is you're like a robot trying to go down the list and please every single member of the coalition.
This is another common occurrence for Ramon and Brianna.
By the way, I've heard similar, you know, ideas coming from like Anna Kasparian too, talking about how at the end of the day, it's just so difficult. You know, I don't know how to navigate sometimes having conversations. Like sometimes I'm just scared to talk to black people, and I'm in my head every time I hear that. I like why? Are you worried you're going to say something racist? Are you thinking something racist right now? I don't know. It's just not, I can't relate to this problem. I don't understand. If I walk into a room like, oh my, shit. Gonna have to really tone down my privilege here. You know, a lot of non-whites in the room. All right. Don't other anybody. Just acknowledge and accept. Or I don't know, just hang out with people, have fun. Like, hey, what are you up to? I don't know much. Like, oh, yeah. Oh my God, the dynamics are different.
To cite her political experience and say, trust me, the Democrats are taking this woke DEI stuff too far. This position has a few uses for her. It allows her to get more conservative voices to listen to her, to even see her as a reasonable trans voice. And it also allows her to further cite that experience when the Democrats inevitably fail at their flaccid electoralism attempts. The problem is that while this might be a useful talking point for Brianna, it's not based in reality, and probably more damning is actually just reciting the conservative framing on these issues back to them. See, she's accepting the ideas being pushed by people like Matt Walsh, Libs of TikTok, Charlie Kirk, and a dozen other slightly misshapen talking heads, acting as though they're good faith arguments or based in reality. Effectively, she is re-gifting to her audience the same framework that is actively being used against people like her, except she's trying to cinch the frame a little tighter so she's not in the picture. The reality, again, very evident to...
And honestly, other people along the same pipeline, like Cenk and Anna, for example, normalize this kind of behavior. If you are having conversations with fascists and you're acknowledging to fascists specifically that there is problems amongst people that you consider to be your allies, you know, and then there's problems with the way that they present their arguments or actually even their demands for, say, wild things like civil rights, you're going to legitimize the position of the fascists you are sitting beside. If you are sitting beside Charlie Kirk, a white supremacist, racist ass Charlie Kirk who's sitting there, and you're like, we have a lot more in common than I thought. We just a lot more commonality here. It's a good thing we're having this beer and this conversation. Otherwise, I wouldn't really know how much we had in common. Oh, great. Yes. Now Charlie Kirk is going to get a massive win that he can go talk to everyone else. Like fucking, oh yeah, those soy cucks basically apparently are all doing everything we make fun of them for. They demand pronoun police. It's like the alphabet mafia who come over and you got to learn like new letters all the time and they don't even know what half of them mean and it's all made up and it's all nonsense in a fairy tale. Like you're not going to find a fascist willing to just like be like, oh, okay, well, I was wrong, Cenk. Fundamentally, they're just using you. They're using you. Yeah, the same thing with Gavin Newsom. They're using you, Gavin. That's why they're so excited to be on your podcast. They're so excited to sit across from you. Well, you got fucking Steve Bannon talking about, yeah, that's why we flooded the zone. Y'all are destroyed. And he's like, yeah, that's politics for you. I got to admit, though, there's nothing more lovely than having conversations. That's what's important. Conversations. Conversations. Talking is what's important. Yeah, what else you got about this whole weird takeover you're doing? Project what? 2000 and something?
Most people in marginalized communities is that Kamala and Biden left those marginalized communities out in the cold in the 2024 campaign. Another reason Brianna can't talk about the real reasons Kamala failed is that Kamala supported the overwhelmingly unpopular ongoing genocide in Gaza, something Brianna bloodthirstily supports. Let's talk about episode 1, where she brings up the Trump campaign ad that said Kamala is for they, them. She notes it's an example of conservatives conflating non-binary people, drag queens, and trans women. And instead of noting that conservatives are regarding them as one and the same, the reason that they're doing that, Brianna, is because they regard any queer identities of any stripe as the same, because it threatens their platform that's based on traditional stereotypes and heterosexuality. She proceeds to just talk about how trans women should separate from those ideas and abandon what should be their queer siblings. But Brianna, that won't matter to the people who are already lumping you in with them. I don't know, maybe it's her conservative roots finally showing through, but this trend of just repeating conservative talking points and agreeing with them uncritically is ever present. For example, in the same first episode, she says in the 90s, non-binary kids would be called goth.
This is why I believe so strongly in transmedicalism. I'm fully with you. Kids need to be able to play with gender. Like, we just used to call these kids goth back in the 90s, right? So, I think that's beautiful. I love that. And I want every single kid to be able to do that. I think the problem is when we're so quick to medicalize this. Kelly, I've used the talking point that you gave last episode literally 3 times this week talking to elected officials, where you were talking about how, like, when you think a lot of the people that start this, they just want to be able to talk about their feelings.
This is just repackaging the same tired social contagion talking points from TERFs who depict all trans teens as vulnerable little babies with no higher cognitive abilities, which is fucking wild to hear, especially from someone who claims to have gone through so much turmoil to find themselves in their 20s like Brianna. Episode 3, she opens talking about Buck Angel. Brianna seems to cozy up to people who hate her or will just openly disrespect her because in her eyes, they'll quote unquote have a conversation with you. Meanwhile, she seems to think the radical trans activists can't have a conversation, probably because she blocks anyone that challenges her. See, she can take pushback from conservatives, but when people actually want to talk with her from the left, she'd rather call them, again, degenerate weirdos.
I mean, you guys know my politics. I have a lot to criticize about trans activism, but when it comes down to it, I will fight with gender criticals. I mean, my mission is our dignity, and I go to war on that every single day. And what I found when I talked to Buck is, yeah, he does have those tendencies to go down those paths, but like you can sit there and talk to him,
clean up your room,
like, access to children transitioning. Like, I have a view that there should be a small window open with extremely high standards. He disagrees, and he will talk about that. And I don't know. I think that's to his credit. There was tons of stuff we disagreed on.
There are other tidbits throughout the various podcast episodes that some might find vaguely strange, like when she talks about being in a medically induced ketamine hole, and that led her on a spirit journey where she was told she'd never be a woman. So apparently her inner woman is transphobic.
And it really changed my personality. It's not a mistake that a lot of the arc I'm on right now is after I did that, because it did make me feel very fearless about what I want to do. But one of the things that clinical ketamine does is you're sitting there and tripping and you're going into the K-hole, as I call it, and you really feel yourself stripped away. All these stories about yourself that you tell, all of it just gets taken apart one by one, and you're just staring there at the core of yourself. And this is so dark, but it's also really beautiful. That what I found at the core of myself repeatedly when I did that was this desire to be a woman. Like, that fundamental thing that I want and cannot have, that's
I got
the
that
essence of what I am. And I think that leads to a melancholy and a pain that never leaves me ever. And, as I've come to this realization that transitioning early would not have cured that, do y'all feel that too? Like, this pain inside of you of always wanting to be something that you can never become?
Somehow that actually makes a lot of sense for Brianna. Of all the insane claims Brianna has made, this is the one I actually have no problem believing. Another very telling incident was on episode 4 of the Dollcast, where in the first 2 minutes, Brianna talks about being in Boston, being sad about Trump winning, and on a whim, taking a vacation to Disney World in Florida with her husband, which is an insane concept to me. I don't know exactly how wealthy Brianna is, but the idea of simply taking days off, flying down and going to Disney World on a whim, that kind of capital is mind-boggling. I'll end our time looking at Brianna's podcast with this diatribe she goes on about how the trans community has failed to police its bad actors. And at least she actually believes that, as we have plenty of evidence that Brianna took that policing personally, as she's the one who's trying to do the policing in those DMs, remember?
Fine, Lib. But I think, to play devil's advocate for just a minute, would the three of you not agree with me? The trans community has completely failed to police our bad actors. Like, we have just sat here silently as it's expanded and expanded and expanded, and you don't need gender dysphoria to be trans, and any kind of medical safeguarding is oppression. And it's really unsurprising to me why the trans movement, largely because people like me just stayed silent and didn't make a big deal out of being trans, like has grown to this place where you do have people with beards going into bathrooms and filming videos about it now. I mean, don't you think like we are somewhat responsible for this mess we're in?
But Brianna, the lying, manipulating, spotlight stealing, backstabbing, blame shifting, political renegade with no wins to speak of, she's the one we should be listening to. Okay. So how has this attempt to establish herself as a more measured voice for trans women actually fared? Well, judging by the number of appearances she gets on more conservative shows like Tim Pool or Trigonometry and others, pretty successful, I guess, for her, she seems to relish being the token trans woman they can get to come on and repeat the things, again, they already believe. But she calls herself a Democrat. She doesn't like Trump, so somehow she's taking part in some grand exchange of ideas in the marketplace and having the tough conversations that need to be had. In 2024, Brianna would pivot almost entirely to argue for what she thinks are trans rights, which for her actually means excluding large parts of the trans community, as we've already gathered. Barry Weiss sums up Brianna well in the introductory paragraph of an interview piece that comes across far more cutting than I think Brianna intended. Quote, "There's no one quite like Brianna Wu. She's a trans woman who advocates passionately for trans healthcare, but also thinks many trans activists have lost the plot and are alienating women and feminists. She's a progressive who once called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez one of the best politicians in America, but is also a staunch supporter of Israel. She was a victim of an alt-right cyber attack during the Gamergate scandal, but now thinks that the far left has become just like that mob. She's a feminist who has argued for more female representation in the gaming industry, but believes that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts have gone way too far." End quote.
Confusing.
If you didn't know everything we've talked about in regards to Brianna, this seems like just a compelling portrait of a beleaguered political moderate, but in context, it kind of just lays out how Brianna has slithered her way through various positions that benefit her. See, Brianna hasn't just spent the last year repeating insane talking points with no credibility or evidence. She's continued to try and use those talking points to cozy up with notable members of the right-wing media ecosystem. The best she's managed so far has been showing off her Porsche collection to Lauren Southern and a chat on Tim Pool's show where they talked about Tim's favorite autistic hyperfixation, Civil War. There's her appearance on Trigonometry, which is apparently a real name people chose to represent themselves and the brand they live by. Trigonometry is apparently a podcast hosted by British Ozempic Ben Shapiro and a horse what they done put a wig and glasses on. I realize I try to go by a rule not to insult people based on their appearances, but that is unfortunately superseded by my other main rule, no mercy for the British. This interview is a perfect showcase of how Brianna is turning herself into a token for conservatives, someone who is utterly unchallenging and will acquiesce to whatever they say, but gives them the ability to literally virtue signal to show how reasonable and rational they are for being open-minded enough to have a trans activist on, which starts by her repeating her talking point about how the Dems are losing because they follow DEI and identity politics.
Plus 2 points, yeah.
I went 20 years without talking about being trans as part of my public profile. I just never wanted it to be what my career is about. But the truth is, you look at these nut jobs that are driving our civil rights right now, I really worry if someone does not stand up and go, we've got to get this movement back to sanity, back to some public policy that people can agree with. I'm terrified about what's going to happen. There's a message you can give people, which is, look, this is my body, my life. I'm going to take this medication. I will accept the responsibility myself. Just let me go make my own choices. People are on board with that. They are not on board with, we're going to announce our pronouns when we meet each other. And if you screw that up, you're going to be socially ostracized.
Yeah, see, she thinks that the Democrats lost the election because they were too radical, which is the level of expert political analysis we can count on her for. Wonder why.
And also, when does that happen? When do you enter the room and then all of a sudden they're like, okay, welcome, but before we proceed, we must first announce pronouns. Failure to do so, and then remember all pronouns will result in ejection from the meeting.
She was never elected. Yeah, it has nothing to do with the fact that, no, the Dems kept trying to reach out to the Republicans while the actual populist movement was just left out in the cold. No, yeah, great. Good job, Brianna.
I think there's an appetite in the Democratic Party right now in this moment to finally kick out the communists. I really do. I think there's an appetite to get rid of these people that have the
Communists
same
have destroyed the
project as
Democratic Party.
theocratic
It's
Israel.
true.
I think there's
Everyone's saying this.
I really do think there's an attitude where we are going to be willing to get rid of our worst actors, including this fringe trans stuff, no matter what happens.
Yeah, Brianna's hatred for theocratic Islam is, well, she's very careful to preface it with being theocratic Islam. But again, if you remember her long history of anti-Arab racism, and you factor in her frankly insane genocide support, it kind of just seems like she hates brown people in a very Ben Shapiro bloodlusty kind of way.
And Israel, it's so disappointing to me that Israel in the last 3 months has taken out the world's trash for it. You know, they've taken out Hamas, they've hurt Hezbollah, they've gone after the IRGC. And, you know, you would think Biden would be like, thank you, Israel. Job well done. We've been trying to kill that guy for 20 years behind the Marine barracks bombing. Instead, it's wagging her finger.
Trash.
And for somebody who constantly is talking about how we need nuance in politics, she has no problem fear-mongering about Hamas having taken over mass mobilized marches even days after the world watched IDF soldiers slaughter medical non-combatants on video. But that to her, oh, that's nobody cares. Yeah, Zionism is the other major hyperfixation for Brianna. At every turn, she seems to support literally any measure taken against not just terrorists, but anyone who might even be the same skin color, or profess support for children and citizens not dying. Like, for example, a support of a Muslim ban.
And just naturally, as someone that's on the left, you're like, Muslim ban? Discriminating against someone on the basis of religion? This is a bad idea. But so much of what I've thought about post-October 7th is if you look at the countries that this ban, which came from Obama, you know, it's like these are countries with people that have some really dangerous ideology. There's a threat to...
This is like verbatim post 9/11 speak, right? To justify the illegal invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. Just to be like, yeah, well, I mean, I know it might seem a little crass for us to go invading other nations and, you know, really bombing the civilian populations there. But at the end of the day, they're dangerous. They hate our freedom. And, you know, a lot of them, unfortunately, have been reading this secret coded text that just turns people into radicals and extremists. And they are trying to commit something called a jihad. So we're going to have to do everything we can.
American citizens. At the very least, we've got to aggressively vet the people we are letting in to make sure they are not going to, you know, start their own Amsterdam incident here in this country. So I'm so much more... I think that October 7th lifted the illusions from a lot of people's eyes across the right and the left. And I think we're going to see those kinds of issues grappled with more honestly this time.
Yes, what a Brianna, just a principled Democrat saying the fascist president is right for trying to not let people of certain skin color into the country. Just a brilliant political mind. If you want a real look into how little Brianna seems to know about the Gaza genocide, or more accurately, how much she willfully ignores, look no further than her interview with Mark Lamont Hill, which was an absolute embarrassment for her to say the least.
Most of the pro-Palestine movement are not Islamists. And
Gaza itself is an Islamist. Like it operates under Sharia law. Yes.
We're talking about a movement, right? I'm assuming the people that you are getting comments from are not in Gaza, right? We're talking about the pro-Palestine movement. You're talking about people, for example, who are commenting from our exchange. Those people aren't in Gaza. The pro-Palestinian movement is a global movement. And most of the people who are pro-Palestinian aren't even Muslim, much less Islamists. Second, you can be Muslim and not be Islamist.
Yes.
And so, you know, much of even historic Palestine, and I don't mean historically, I mean like much of the region right now, most Palestinians are Muslim, but most don't live in Gaza. And most of those people would not identify as Islamists based on all the polls, based on all the data.
Really? You don't think Free Palestine at its core is
an Islamist movement?
I absolutely think that.
What does Islamist mean to you?
I was going to say, I think in like if there's a tier list of people who I would want to discuss this issue with, not knowing anything about it, Mark Lamont Hill would be at the very bottom. I would not want to sit across from Mark Lamont Hill and start trying to ramble on about a topic that I really, really didn't know a lot about, and I was resting solely on just basically pretty racist hatred of an entire group of people for my justification for it, and then have to keep talking, right? Like you can't just say something out loud and then afterwards be like, yeah. And he's like, well, okay, could you actually define the term then? Just so we could, because I got to get to the root of where exactly you're coming up with the things that you're saying. So we're going to break this down piece by piece. Oh, no. No, I'd like to not do that, actually. Not do that at all. I'd rather we just move on to the next thing and not talk about that thing anymore, please. That would be better.
This project to conflate Islam with the state and to usher that into a form of government.
She basically shrugs at the idea of kids being targeted and killed, kind of just saying, well, them's the breaks in war.
every piece of the built environment nearly of Gaza has been reduced to rubble. I mean, it's at least at 80%. Now, every school has been destroyed. 80%.
Oh, it's horrible. It's horrible looking at the pictures, yeah.
But we also see the killing of doctors. We see the killing of journalists. We see the killing of educators.
It's really easy to say child killed, all of this. There are a tremendous number of child soldiers that are working alongside PIJ, militants, working alongside Hamas.
It's really easy to say child killed, but like you've already changed the topic. Oh yeah, it's easy to bring up all the kids who are dead. What, to virtue signal and then win some woke points or whatever. But have you ever talked about the child soldiers of Hamas? Huh? And how deadly they can be? And that's extra wild considering that, like, she posted just recently, what I'm sure are very true stories about seeing Palestinian children killing dogs. Just, again, to further dehumanize a group of people undergoing a genocide.
They're trained with weapons. It's horrible. Hamas is committing a war crime by using child soldiers, and that is a non-trivial number of those deaths. It's just an absolute fact.
Karachi, thank you for being a member for 1 month. It's all about Brianna Wu's lifelong dream of getting J.K. Rowling's approval and friendship. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone will ever gain J.K. Rowling's approval, except for the mold.
As far as some of this technology of white phosphorus and all of that, I think those claims are really overblown.
Also need to bring up this wonderful chef's kiss of a moment where she says Kamala won't be affected by her support for Israel. I wonder why Brianna doesn't have a job at Rebellion PAC anymore.
Yeah, I think the fact that it doesn't look like the DNC is going to result in Chicago on fire, I feel really good about us just being able to kind of continue through the election.
And if that is the case, if what you prognosticate is accurate,
yes,
and I suspect it is, does Kamala Harris win?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be surprising then that, like her purposefully misunderstanding non-binary people, making it easier for her to villainize them and valorize her very smart and centrist positions, Brianna doesn't really care how much evidence of a genocide she's presented with. She has continually advocated for basically the entire total ethnic extermination of Gazans. And like most of the rabid Zionists, will fall back on tired arguments like Israel has a right to exist and Palestinian protesters are terrorist sympathizers, when really the only thing anyone is advocating for that she is against is Israel stopping the mass slaughter of women, children, and non-combatants. That's it. Again, this is the person who wants to present herself as a voice of reason, who knows what she's talking about. Her Zionist position might be the clearest example, but we've seen plenty how she just absolutely ignores any evidence or conversations that might actually disprove or challenge her in any way. It's legitimately sickening to watch, like her open praising of Mahmoud Khalil's DHS arrest, where she's been justifying the extrajudicial targeting of a legal immigrant because he advocated for the rights of suffering and dying people. But to her, these positions aren't extreme. Oh no. The extremists are the people who want a ceasefire. Now, if you've heard some of the things Brianna says about communists, it's very clear that much like non-binary representation and just a larger queer community in general, she has no idea what the fuck she's talking about. Could her lack of knowledge with these positions have anything to do with not ever talking to leftists and getting most of her ideas, or at least approaches, from mainstream conservatism? Who's to say?
This is what drives me crazy about this current trans movement. When I transitioned over 20 years ago, the message was your fate is in your own hands, right? If you pass, if you're employed, that's up to you. You have to learn these skills so you can build a good life for yourself. That's the way it was for a long time. Instead, the trans movement has taken on this victimhood. And I'm opposed to it, not just because it's politically cowardly, but it is taking an entire generation of girls that are just like me and telling them the thing that isn't gonna, the thing that you're waiting for to make your life better is a communist utopia.
Like how do I even approach this idea that trans girls are indoctrinated into a communist utopia? What does communism have to do with defining concepts of gender? We could honestly be here all day watching her flap her overly thin lips, arguing total nonsense, but I really don't think it's necessary. Skip through any podcast appearance she makes or talking head segment she somehow managed to finagle. You'll see this highly qualified Politico stumbling through the same lukewarm takes we've heard dozens of times with no substance behind them. But it is catching up with her. She can only be insulated by money and what connections she actually has for so long. Now, Brianna spends her days arguing online, in her own mind besieged as one of the last holdouts of true transness with other people she now apparently calls comrades like Blair White. Recently, she claimed to have a debate with Blair because she's got nothing left to generate views except causing tired controversies. But here's how that debate went.
I agreed with you. I 100% agreed with you. To the kids' point that you brought up, Blair, I really feel you. I do want to agree with you strongly, because I think, Blair, what you said about children growing out of it's very true. You're talking.
I think that's the Mediaite guy in the middle. Like for a while, I was like, Mediaite kind of seems just like a liberal clip harvesting website style farm. And then they started producing their own YouTube videos and content, and that guy in the middle was like doing a lot of them, and then they would be strangely right-leaning. It's bizarre.
Like there's a ton of surgery on children, and I fully agree with you for these FTMs. You said something at the beginning of this, which is trans women we've been run out of our own movement, which is 100% true. This non-binary fringe has come into it, and to use Free Palestine's phrase, they've colonized us.
Yeah, I agree. Just to, expand slightly and then we can move on, is like, I completely agree. It's like,
here we are. We're two trans women that feel like our civil rights vehicle has been hijacked by lunatics. How do we, trans women, actual trans women, not pretend trans women, not non-binaries, how do we build something where we can have a say in our own healthcare again?
She may have found new friends, or at least people willing to use her as much as she uses them for exposure and clout. But like I said at the beginning, Brianna doesn't have a community. And if the trends in her behavior, both in front and behind the scenes, are anything to go by, she'd talk shit about literally any of them in a group chat the second she thought it might get her more popularity with someone with a slightly larger audience. So it's not surprising that most of her time seems to be spent arguing on social media with accounts like me. I think the point I really decided to make this video was shortly before Brianna.
If you ever read the book, The Thin Pink Line, I think that's it. It talks a lot about how this is often done conflating LGBTQ plus rights with neoliberalism in order to justify a lot of the actions of the US government, especially when it comes to what they're doing in other countries, imperialism, that kind of shit. It gets back to what I was talking about with Isaac earlier, where it's just like, Gaza doesn't allow for gay people to exist, so if you went there, you'd be stoned to death. So you're like a chicken for KFC, bro. You go over there, they kill you, man. So why are you even talking about them? Don't they know the Palestinians want you dead because of Sharia law or something? And yeah, so why would you ever do? And it's like. The kids are being starved and bombed to death right now. The least of my worries about how progressive I think they are. I just don't think they should be getting bombed and starved to death. I don't think that should be happening, let alone like, some faction of my government assisting it. That's disgusting and grotesque to me. That's as far as it goes. And like there's been enough comedians at this point who have had entire bits where it's like, they'll get there, like if you don't have bombs dropping on your face every day and you're worried about where you're going to be finding your next meal, or read Mike Figueredo's book. He explains this all about how post-scarcity and pre-scarcity societies, right? And how effectively if people are really, really worried about the resources, where they're going to be getting them from, that's kind of going to be a primary concern. They're not just sitting there thinking like, wow, I wonder what my relationship with gender is, or I wonder sometimes if I question my own sexuality, and I don't know, maybe I could potentially be a bisexual or a pansexual. I've heard of these terms and all this kind of stuff. Like it's literally, I don't want to die today. That would probably be the only thing I'd be thinking of. I wouldn't be sitting around being like, yeah, I really, really want to explore elements of my own sexuality. You'd be like, I hope I don't get fucking bombed to death today from the bombs that are raining down upon us, the hellfire, all that shit.
Yeah, with accounts like me. I think the point I really decided to make this video was shortly before Brianna blocked me, where she said non-binary people aren't trans, to which I responded, I'm transgender, I'm non-binary. I go through trans healthcare. I get electrolysis. I've been on hormones for years. To which she responded by saying, I'm not non-binary, I'm transsexual. Brianna, you can call yourself whatever you want. But your problem is that because you think you've come to know yourself and realized your gender journey, you think you can speak for everyone else. And you make no effort to understand others. And that's always been true. Don't let her inability to see the world from a less privileged perspective, her lack of any kind of empathy for the struggles of someone else, distract you from the fact that first and foremost, Brianna Wu is an opportunistic, manipulative liar. She shouldn't be trusted, not because she never knows what she's talking about, but because she will say whatever she thinks you want to hear if it will get you to support her and get her a little bit more visibility. And after examining her entire career, it doesn't seem like there was some grand transformation over time. From the very beginning, her time in college and her work on an animation studio that crashed, her career has been defined by an abundance of unearned confidence, manipulation, volatility, and a lack of any consequences. So maybe this video will do nothing. Maybe it's just preaching to more of the choir who already have her blocked on Blue Sky, but I'm honestly okay with that. If, on the other hand, Brianna were to lose her power and influence, it should be seen as due rewards for her history of lying and coercion. If she has no friends or no political career because she is finally seen by all as the corrosive, toxic person she is, I'd have no problem with that. And even if all of that were to happen, she'd be fine because she's fucking rich. But regardless how any of these things behind the scene coming to light affects her, I can say one thing with certainty. In the end, Brianna won't have anyone left to stand up for her. She won't have anyone left to bring her on podcasts and pay her for being a consultant, at least not if she continues the way she has for decades. And that has nothing to do with a YouTuber compiling a deep dive. It's all by her hand. Goodwill is not an unlimited resource, and Brianna has stripped the mountains of her career dry of any goodwill she managed to wring from Gamergate, from her political career, and from what sparse experience she actually has. So in the end, if Brianna Wu ends up alone, isolated, and hollow, it's not because of the rest of the world. It's because it's what she's always been building towards through her own actions.
This was excellent. Really good work. Everyone should go subscribe to Dead Domain and support their channel. Here's the link. There's the link in Dead Domain. Will be joining the Leftist Mafia next Thursday.
Don't let this happen to you. Go to serfscoffee.com to order the only end-to-end owned indigenous coffee company that delivers blood-free, conflict-free, and cruelty-free beans right to your door. 0% of people who drink serfscoffee.com have exploded spontaneously. By ordering right now, you get 10% off plus free shipping, and it's the best way to enjoy delicious coffee while not exploding. That's serfscoffee.com, serfscoffee.com.
Hey, if you'd like to unlock secret bonus episodes as well as uncensored content, go to patreon.com/theserfs. This show is produced by Anna Loves Riley, Arian McCarthy, Cheryl Alvarez, Comrade Junkie, Doug Caddy, Everything Important, Hagbard Celine, Jimmy Sombrero, Voltimondi, Omni, Political Poppy, Preston Kroll, Quiet 185, Riley and Anna, Roller Dragon, Cernicus, Stellar Gwyn, Sebastian Demel, Travis McClinton, Trincell, Words Greenwood, with additional support coming from all of these amazing human beings right here.